Fraser, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 6, written by L. Muir. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Chapter 1. It had been a strange night on Culloden Moor, far more eventful after the solstice revellers had left the grounds. If they had any ken of what was transpiring at the moment, they'd be back in droves, as would the ghost-seekers hoping to see what was never meant for them to see. Standing before the memorial cairn, Culloden's ragtag collection of 79 Highland spirits had been gathered, enthralled by Sansere Muir, their wee mortal mascot turned witch. With a promise of revenge, the 16-year-old had begun luring them one by one to step close to her unworldly fire and leave the moor for a brief quest. Only after winning their enthusiasm had she declared that, whether or not they succeeded, they would be moving on to the afterlife. Number 18, Lachlan McLean, had been the first to depart. Jamie Houston, number 64, had followed soon after, with no hesitation. Fitzpeyton, number 48, had just stepped forward and been welcomed with a smile from the lass, which proved the order in which they'd risen from their graves had nothing to do with the order in which they would be sent away. A pity that, since the youngest laddie's number was 8, his chance would have come soon. In case there was some reason for the order in which they'd risen, they'd always held tight to their number in line, so to speak. Some had even forgotten they'd had a name to go along with their number, so Alexander had remembered for them. But if God or the devil were calling them out of order, then perhaps the wee laddie could go straight away. Kavanagh, the dusk of morning, wouldn't be long in coming, and if only a few could depart this night, he'd rather young Rabby was part of the first wave. The concern was whether the boy would be up to the quest he was given. Alexander glanced to his left, locked eyes with Rabby, and read the same question there. The wee lad's hand gripped his hound's fur and held, a stark variation from petting the animal continually for nearly 270 years. A mortal dog would have lost its hide 1,000 times over from all the comfort this one got. "This stay alert, aye," he told Rabby. "And ye as well, Dauphin," he said to the dog, simply because it pleased Rabby when anyone addressed his loyal beast. The lad nodded solemnly, and Dauphin's ears pointed forward as if he'd understood his instruction too. After a quick nod to the witch, Fitzpeyton disappeared into nothing, but not before the rest of them caught sight of an excited grin on his face. Alexander glanced at the boy again, and found the light of hope gleaming in his eyes like heavy tears waiting to fall. "Would ye care to give her a try, Rabby?" For he could think of nothing more satisfying than getting that brave child off the moor and where he belonged. Culloden, with all its horrors and memories of horrors, was no place for one so young, and if there had been someone to whom Alexander could have complained, he'd have done so the first day they'd risen from their graves. The lad shook his head quickly. "I canna do it, sir. I canna. What if they've gone to the devil?" Alexander laughed quietly so as not to draw attention from the others. "Can you imagine our Sansere doing such a thing? Suggesting such a thing?" He shook his head with a touch of reproach. "For shame to think it, Rabby, for the lass is as good as one of us, aye." Rabby nodded, placated. Then he brightened. "Would ye go first, sir? I believe I could do it if ye go first." He swallowed painfully, then began patting Dauphin again, as if it was the animal that needed soothing. "And perhaps if you find something disagreeable like, you'll find a way to let me know." The lass had warned that once a man left the moor, he wouldn't be coming back again. But surely, if God was in his heaven, He'd allow Alexander to get word to the laddie. It was plain all the boy needed was a nudge, and he'd jump at the chance to leave, as would Alexander. Thanks to the fictional character named Fraser in a well-loved Scottish novel, Alexander's existence on the grounds of Culloden had become its own bit of hell. His common Scottish name had become nigh onto a war cry for romantic-minded lasses the world over, and for a man who'd been denied his own true love in life, it was torture to see so much affection wasted on a fellow who'd never truly existed in the first place. And it was getting worse by the day, thanks to the story being played out on film. Aye, it was a fine time for making his own escape. Alexander nodded to Rabby, then motioned for number 55 to watch over the lad. The other ghost, Kennedy, had a way with Rabby the others did not, and if Alexander couldn't be by the boy's side, 55 was the next best thing. Only after he got a nod from Kennedy did he start forward, weaving between his comrades as he closed the distance between himself and the wee witch. But he stopped when 26 started kicking up a ruckus. Apparently, the man was trying to jump the line when it was clear his brother had been invited forward at the whim of the witch, but it seemed she didn't wish for Gareth McGregor to be next. Alexander waited for the argument to end, and while he waited, he met the gaze of the others who stood at the perimeter of the witch's fiery display. Without a word, he made it clear that he would be the next to step forward if Sonny would allow it, as soon as the troublesome McGregors worked out their family squabble. Finally, the hot-headed Gareth McGregor was allowed to have his way, but instead of disappearing into nothing as the others had done before him, he darted off defiant as you please, ignoring Sonny's demands to return. The others watched him go, but Alexander was more interested in the witch. He kept his gaze upon her, waiting for his opportunity to speak up for himself. Sansa turned back to her fire, and the trace of a smile was quickly wiped from her expression before she faced the rest of Culloden's 79, a number quickly dwindling. The fleeting smile left Alexander wondering if the hot-headed Gareth hadn't been as defiant as he'd supposed. For wherever he'd gone, it seemed Sonny was all too pleased about it. Alexander spoke quickly before he had time to reconsider. Sansa,
Alexander Fraser. You'd like to go next, would you?
aye, lass, he said, stepping forward. I have reason to. Sonny glanced past him in the direction of a certain young lad and his dog.
I see.
She waved him closer for a private word, as she'd done with some of the others. If she'd had any instruction for McGregor, he'd missed the chance to hear it by running off.
Alexander,
She said, then bit her lip for a moment. The action tightened his belly with worry.
'tis a noble thing you do, even now.
He frowned down at her. Surely you'd not reward a boon just for my volunteering. As you can guess, the lad watches me to see if it's safe to go, so you must send me somewhere, and if it is possible in any way for me to come back and tell Rabby there's nothing to fear, I must do it. The lad trusts ye, no mistake, but he trusts me more, you ken. Sonny nodded with a knowing smile and a wink.
Oh, I'll be sending you somewhere, never fear. Only,
Again, his belly tightened. What is it, lass? She inhaled loudly through her nostrils, as if inflating her courage. Then she let the breath go quickly and forced her lips back into a pretty bow.
only if you wish to come back to speak with Rabby, there will be a price to pay.
You mean to tell me that I'll lose my boon? That I'll lose my chance to call out Bonnie Prince Charlie? Her lips twisted in regret, and she nodded. Done.
Just like that?
The lass was taken aback. Just like that. Now, let's get on with it. I dinna wish for Rabby to fret over long. Sonny shook her head.
The sun will rise soon, and I've a mortal body to care for, aye? You'll be the last to leave this night. Rabby and the others may find their rest for a few days while I tend to business. Do you understand?
He nodded his head. I understand only one thing, truth be told. He braced his feet apart and held out his hands for balance, unable to imagine what might truly happen to him next. I only ken that it is high time Rabby left this place.
Oh, and what of you? Will you miss the chance to bask in the celebrity of being a Fraser? Even the ghost of one?
He snorted. Even as a man, I would not welcome such a thing. Sonny clicked her tongue and shook her head, a look of mischief in her eyes.
'Tis too bad then.
What do you mean? She bounced her brows and grinned.
You'll see.
With Sonny's teasing still ringing in his ears and the sight of her not yet faded from his vision, he felt the ground disappear from beneath him, and though he had no sensation of falling, he had sensations aplenty. But just as he was beginning to revel in the feel of blood coursing through his veins again, a wave flooded him and washed him out into a deep sea of slumber. Chapter 2. Chelsea stood before the framed oval mirror and stared at her reflection because that was what she was supposed to do, right? Once a bride was dressed in her dress and the last touches were touched, she was supposed to stand and stare at herself and concentrate on burning the memory into her brain, wasn't she? She wished Austin was there with her. Then the picture would be complete. He always made her calm, happy, relaxed, like nothing in the world could be wrong as long as they were together. She really was the luckiest girl in the world. A wedding in Scotland, something she never would have dreamed of, never would have been greedy enough to ask for, but Austin had insisted. She stood in the bride's room of what was called a small chapel, but Scotland's version of small was an American version of cathedral. The ancient stone walls were covered with tapestries depicting equally ancient wedding ceremonies. In one, the bride and groom stood with their arms tied together with a cloth, and she was pretty sure the red splotches were supposed to be blood, because some guy standing next to them was holding up a red-tipped knife. She could almost imagine him grinning. It was like a Scottish version of a blood brother ceremony, only with a couple. But lucky for her, she wasn't marrying a Scot, and she was pretty sure they didn't do that anymore anyway. The closest she and Austin had come was to have a blood test, and only because his mother insisted on it. The woman was almost disappointed when Chelsea's report came back with no dormant family illnesses lurking inside her, waiting to spring up and taint the Forbes family name. Just a few more hours, and she'd be able to latch onto Austin and never let him out of her sight, leaving the wedding party behind while they started their honeymoon trip around the country. But it didn't matter how much she wanted to tour castles and listen to Scottish legends. She would much rather lock herself away in a cottage with her new husband for a few weeks and let the stress of the wedding fade into a memory. She would never truly be able to relax, though, until the best man left the island. He was scheduled to fly to Paris the next morning, but she wouldn't believe it until she saw it. He was so attached to Austin, she could just imagine waking up after their wedding night to find Rick sitting at the end of the bed, glaring at her whenever Austin's back was turned. The vivid memory of that glare sent a shiver through her that rippled up her spine and shook the layers of her dress. A knock on the heavy wood door made her jump, and before she had time to take a step, it opened. She smiled, hoping it was Austin sneaking in for a quick kiss and a promise it wouldn't be long now. In the mirror, She could see the clear white V of a tuck shirt front glowing in the dim light of the hallway.
"You're not supposed to see me yet."
She said as she turned, but she dropped her smile when Rick barged his way into her cold and lonely sanctuary.
"What do you want?"
He sneered. Careful, Cheese. You don't want Austin to hear you use that tone with me. He called her Cheese when he thought someone might hear. Others assumed it was a form of endearment, telling her she was one of the guys. But when they were alone, he called her Cheesy, and he meant it in the worst way. She was so close to finally getting between that weasel and Austin, she really should have expected him to attack her one last time, but at least she wasn't stupid enough to rise to the bait. He had to feel desperate at the moment, and there was no guessing how dangerous he could be. His eyes always promised she would pay for rejecting him once, and what better time to make her pay than on her wedding day? She braced her feet apart a little, hidden by the wide white skirt, just in case he tried something physical. He closed the door and locked it. The snap of the bolt slipping into place turned her stomach. It also made her regret every chance she'd had to tell Austin his best friend hated her, but it was too late now. Holding her tongue and hoping for the best had been a stupid move, and Rick had promised that Austin would believe his very different version of the truth if she ever tried to come between the two men. He walked a slow circle around her, and though every instinct screamed not to turn her back on him, she never moved. He looked down his nose at the dress, then brought his gaze slowly up to her face before stopping in front of her again. But he didn't speak. No off-handed compliments. No glaring. Nothing. She glanced at the clock. 15 minutes. Could she hold her tongue that long? Not much time left, he said quietly. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. He frowned. If you're gonna do it, you'd better hurry. She had no idea what he was talking about, and she wasn't gullible enough to ask. She knew she should stick her fingers in her ears until someone came to say it was time to head down the aisle, but her pride wouldn't let her do anything Rick might laugh at. He snorted. You stupid cow. Don't tell me you haven't at least been considering it. She raised an eyebrow. She instantly wished she could have taken the move back. Leaving, you idiot. You should leave, now. You know you should. You're not good enough for Austin, and you know it. You understand the kind of woman he needs, not a low-class waitress from the wrong side of the tracks. You know he wants to do well in politics, and you will only be the death of him. He pointed his finger at her. You see, even now you don't say anything because you know I'm right. He'd grown more passionate as he spoke, but still hushed. He knew that someone would be knocking on the door in the next few minutes, and he was always so clever about keeping his revulsion of her a secret. All she had to do was wait for that knock. It didn't matter what the hateful pig said. He was just making a last-ditch effort to stop the wedding. If he got rid of her, he would be more careful about the women Austin was able to meet. But he'd made a fateful mistake one night when he'd gotten the flu and allowed his friend to go to the Celtics game without him. And Austin, being Austin, hadn't thought twice about stopping at a diner that was so unworthy of someone like him. She smiled at the memory of a too charming blonde guy with rows of dimples dumping his pie on his own lap just so she would have to come to his rescue.
"I'm so sorry,"
She'd said, trying to wipe up the mess on the bench beside him with a wet towel. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, he'd said quietly, but I'm sorry about the ice cream hitting the floor. They'd laughed together then, the first of 1,000 laughs. Maybe this will help convince you, Cheesy, Rick said, holding up a small digital recorder. He pressed a button and sat it on the dressing table, then walked out. Too bad you're not marrying Erica Winston. Rick's voice was unmistakable. Did you see that her father is running for Congress? Yeah, I saw that. Austin's voice had a wistful edge that she couldn't miss. Not there alone, with no one to keep a straight face for. If I hadn't been sick that night when you went to the Celtic game without me, we'd be waiting for Erica right now. Austin laughed. Can you imagine Erica Winston settling for a small wedding in some dusty old chapel in Scotland? Rick laughed too, but Austin probably didn't know a fraction of how pleased his friend was to be recording him at that moment. Waiting for Erica right now, he'd said. So the conversation had just taken place. Had they been standing in the chapel? It was their wedding day, and he was still thinking about Erica. How long had Rick been recording her fiancé, hoping for just the right soundbite? She could only imagine how pleased he was with himself at the moment. In fact, he was probably standing outside her door, waiting for her to fall to pieces. If she was smart, she'd turn it off. She reached for the recorder, but paused when Austin spoke again. Marrying her would have cost me a whole lot more than moving the wedding party to Scotland. Yeah, Rick said, but it would have been worth it. You think? Well, that was hardly a quick denial, but she could only hear his voice, not see the expression on his face. He'd probably rolled his eyes when he said it. After all, he knew Rick well enough not to argue with him when he didn't have to. The devil chimed back in. Only if you want to be a congressman someday. Or better, can't do that if you marry a waitress with drug-addicted parents. Well, too late now, isn't it? No, man, it's not too late. The recording cut off. Too late now, isn't it? It wasn't just the words, but the regret in his voice that stung. Chelsea realized she'd been holding her breath and sucked air deep into her lungs. She only wished it didn't hurt so bad to do it. Her chest seemed determined to empty itself of all oxygen, blood, even her heart. Her ribs felt like clumps, squeezing everything together, waiting for something to pop. Suddenly, having Austin with her didn't seem like such a comforting thought after all, but she needed something. Knuckles rapped softly against the door.
Miss Chase, they're ready for you.
The vicar's wife. So, true to form, Rick must have taken his place again, smiling like there was nothing wrong. Would he be whispering in Austin's ear while they waited, trying to convince him he shouldn't go through with the ceremony? She was so mad at the weasel, she wanted to scream, but she couldn't. Not without Austin coming to see what the matter was. Then, all of the ugly truth between her and Rick would have to come out. Only, Rick would have his own twisted version. Either way, the day would be ruined. No matter how blissful the rest of their wedding day might be, the memory would be half covered in mud. Unfortunately, those emotions bottled up inside her still demanded a release and escaped as a river of tears down her cheeks. It only made her madder.
Oh, Austin.
She did need him, but the secret he seemed to be keeping from her, that he regretted the loss of his ambitions, created a chasm she couldn't see across, a chasm created by her enemy. She took tissues and stomped close to the mirror to dab away the tears. They had burned a trail through her makeup, but brides cried all the time, right? She forced a smile to see if she could pull off the happy tear look, but it was a stretch. One deep breath later, and she was looking for her bouquet and headed out the door. Rick Burrell was not going to win today, and soon she would start eliminating him from her and Austin's lives altogether. The vicar's wife was gone. There was a tall, skinny young man standing at the door to the chapel, but he was leaning in, watching something. No one was there to notice her, and she had declined having Austin's dad walk her down the aisle in favour of walking alone. There was no one waiting for her, no one to signal the wedding march. She stepped quietly to the door so she didn't startle the young man, then peeked in to see what he was looking at. She kept her body back so no one noticed her. Austin stood at the front grinning and hugging a woman in white wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Then he turned and introduced her to the vicar. Rick grinned too and glanced at the doorway. His eyes locked on Chelsea's for only a fraction of a second. He winked, then looked back at the woman in white, and Chelsea realized, without seeing her face, it had to be Erica Winston. Austin was standing at the altar next to the woman he really wished he was marrying. It didn't matter that it had all been set up by Rick. It didn't matter if Austin was just being polite and greeting his former girlfriend while he waited for the wedding march to start. The chick was probably in on it too, planning just the right time to barge up to him and demand a hug. If Chelsea had stuck her fingers in her ears and not listened to Rick, she would be waving for someone to start the music and gliding happily and oblivious down the aisle. She would have said her vows, held her breath only for a second or two while the clergyman asked if anyone objected, then accepted the ring. She would have been minutes away from kissing the groom and going on her merry way, relieved when she knew for sure that the devil would never be able to get between them again. So what was stopping her? Why didn't she do just that? It would gall Rick to see her play the game and win, and the competitor in her wanted just that, to win. But she also loved Austin too much to make him unhappy, too much to ruin his career, if he still wanted to change the world like he had when they'd met. And if she loved him too much to give him up, was that selfish? Or just Rick's brainwashing kicking in? Her next decision would determine everything. Did she hurt him now? Or later on, after the regrets surfaced? By then, it wouldn't matter if he divorced her. His political future would be tainted. The worm was at least right about that. But maybe he was wrong about Austin really caring about that future. The woman in white stepped back a few feet and sat next to Austin's parents like she was one of the family. Austin frowned and looked at his watch, but then leaned toward Rick, who was whispering to him, a few choice tidbits, no doubt, about how convenient it was that Erica was wearing white, and since the bride was running late, he could fix his future if he just moved fast enough. The young man finally took his attention off the diva in white, now that only her wide, obnoxious hat was all that was visible. He noticed Chelsea standing there, gasped, and started to raise a hand, probably to signal the organist. Chelsea shook her head and he lowered his hand.
Could you do me a favour? Could you go tell the groom I'd like a word with him? Discreetly.
A word? He rolled the R with his thick brogue. She thought he might sprain his tongue. Aye, miss. He walked quickly but calmly to the front of the chapel and bent toward Austin. Rick leaned close to eavesdrop. Then he laughed and clapped Austin on the shoulder. But it wasn't Austin that headed back with the young man. It was Rick. No. She should have just allowed the guy to start the music and gone to him herself. There would be no getting close to him now. Rick had paid a circle around him, stalked his territory, and was going to defend it to the death. He paused and bent down to speak to someone, and Chelsea took one last look at Austin.
Look at me, baby. Just one look. That's all I need.
But Austin's attention was on his parents, or rather, on the woman sitting beside them. She waved a long, gloved hand and beckoned him closer. He never so much as glanced Chelsea's way. Rick stood and started walking again, hiding a pleased grin inside that pleasant smile. Chelsea grabbed handfuls of her skirt, lifted it, and ran. Chapter 3. Alexander woke to the feel of someone licking his forehead. For a moment he marvelled at the sensation of being touched, but he quickly brought up his arms to defend himself from an overly friendly dog. The first, besides Dolphin, that had truly seen him in centuries. There had been plenty a creature that could sense the ghosts on Culloden Moor, but none that dared stray near them. It had been an additional pang of loneliness, in truth, to have the animals shy away, and Dolphin's attention had been for Rabby only. "You'll have to forgive Wallace," said an old man hiking up the gravel incline. It was a road with a trail of grass down the centre and soft loam to either side, and it was the loam where Alexander had apparently slept the night away. He jumped to his feet and brushed at the dirt that was no longer clinging to his plaid, after being ever present for nearly 3 centuries. Also missing were his weapons. Sonny expected an heroic deed from him without a blade to hand. So be it. "That dog will lick anyone with a little sweat on him. Likes the salt, you see." The man leaned on a tall walking stick while he looked Alexander over. "You've arrived early then. I was not to be here until 11 o'clock. He nodded to hide his confusion and looked about. A large cottage with a fine, smooth roof was tucked into the trees at the top of the rise. A small black car sat at the bottom of the hill where the man had come from. The man squinted at his boots. "No car. Someone dropped ye." Dropped? Lifted and dropped by the witch, he supposed. So he nodded. "Aye. Well, it's a good thing I've brought some things to stock the cold bucks. It was all part of the arrangement, of course, but at least you will not have need to hike into town any time soon." Alexander followed the man to the building, wary for whatever heroic opportunities might arise, but there was none to molest them but the dog, and he tried to smother them with affection was all. "Now, I'll unlock the door for ye, but you'll find another set of keys on the hook in case you go somewhere and wish the lock up behind ye. When ye depart in 2 days' time, ye flip the locks and pull the doors closed, leaving those keys on the hook where ye found them. Aye." Alexander shrugged. "Aye." The man unlocked the door as he spoke and pushed it open. "Would ye care to look about? See that everything is in order while I hike back to the car for the foodstuffs." "Food?" The fellow frowned. "Aye, for the cold bucks." "Would you like me to fetch it for ye? Any good deed would surely work in his favour." The old man rolled his eyes. "No, what I'd like is for ye to take a look about and see if you need anything else from me before I go. There's nae telephone and paltry service at best, aye, so you canna ring me up to complain later, and I would like Mr. Muir to be pleased." "Mr. Muir arranged for me to stay here, did he?" A relation to Sonny Muir, no doubt. The poor man's face fell. "Will it not suit ye? I can see if there's something fancier for ye, but he specifically asked for this property, mind. But if you didn't care to be out in the woods, cut off from—" "The cottage is fine, sir, and glad I am for it. If Mr. Muir said I am to stay here, then here I shall stay." The disgruntled fellow sighed mightily, then nodded his head and started down the hill. As he picked his way, he poked at the air and mumbled something about actors not knowing their own minds. Alexander looked down at his clothes and realized that in the current day and age, even in Scotland, his kilt would be considered a costume, but he didn't care for the notion of being mistaken for an actor. He remembered his immediate duty was to check inside the large cottage and see if there was aught more he should need, though he had no idea what his heroic deed would require, therefore he could not predict those needs. In any case, he stepped inside as he'd been encouraged to do. It was a much larger building than he'd first suspected. A great deal of it must have been hidden behind the trees and shrubbery. The ceiling was foolishly high and empty of anything but rafters. In winter, there would never be enough wood to keep the place warm. It was a wonder any trees at all could be found nearby. But then he remembered that heat was acquired another way as well. And a quick look at the hearth suggested that fires indoors were few and far between. The grate appeared clean and fairly new, as did the stones along that wall. Nary a speck of dust could be seen. Two long couches sat at right angles to each other and were covered in fine, soft leather that lent its smell to the place. Above one wall was hung the preserved head of a red stag, on the opposite wall the head of a smallish boar. "Take a good look at the bedroom and water closet now, while I put these things away." The old man carried a large box into the next room after nodding toward a door beyond the stag's wall. Alexander was more interested in the kitchen, but the fastest way to be rid of the man was to do as he was told, so he walked to the door and pushed it open. And when he did so, his mortal ears heard the faint gasp of a woman. His gaze flew to the bed, but it was piled with so many furs and blankets there was no telling what truly lay beneath. But he was sure. "The toilet's through here, you see." The proprietor pushed past him in spite of his movements to block the man, but the fellow was in such a hurry he never glanced at the bed. "Bespoke linens, of course," came his voice from the water closet. Then he poked his head out. "Shower, large bathing tub, plenty of towels, unless you've some to do in the jacuzzi." He gave Alexander a glower that suggested he expected nefarious deeds to take place as soon as he drove away. "I expect no one," Alexander assured him. But the old man just grunted and strode out of the room, again still not glancing at the bed. "You've plenty of back bacon, eggs, tomatoes, and mushrooms. There's milk and some orange juice, of course, and 2 roast chickens as was ordered. I left the bottle of wine on the counter so you can do as you please with it. But since you're not expecting guests—" He wagged his head back and forth, again like he didn't believe the claim. "Thank ye kindly." The man took one more look around. "Well then, I'll leave ye to your solitude, shall I?" Alexander escorted him to the door, shook his hand, then watched through the sheer cloth over the window until the man drove away. He smiled and hoped, wherever Sonny was, after her long night on the moor, that she knew he was pleased to have been given a place to stay, and apparently food for his belly. At least he wouldn't need to spend his first mortal evening hunting in unfamiliar woods. The sound of the automobile was all but gone when he jumped back and hurried to the kitchen to find the food and wine. He tried to discover how to open the icebox or refrigerator. He knew the name of it from the television he'd watched over the past few decades, but he suddenly remembered that he was not, in fact, alone. Food, wine, a private shelter, and a woman in his bed. He pulled his fingers away from the icebox as if it had burned him. Then he backed out of the kitchen while dividing his attention between the bottle of wine and the bedchamber door to his left. A few more steps and he'd be out the door. Then he would run. For surely Mr. Muir was the devil himself, sent to steal his soul before he could fulfill his quest. Chapter 4. Chelsea had no option but to huddle under the blankets and wait to be busted. Deep voices in the next room woke her when she hadn't even realized she'd nodded off. The place had looked deserted enough, and she didn't see any harm in seeking a little refuge while she figured out what she'd do next. After all, it wasn't like she was going to rob the place, and she'd picked the lock without making a mess of the door. No harm, no foul. But then she'd decided to take off the wedding dress and lie down for a little while. 2 miles was only a warm-up for her usually, but she usually wasn't running it in a wedding dress and fancy shoes. The dress she draped over a large, frumpy chair and crawled under the covers, looking for comfort more than warmth. Then she'd forced herself to think of a blank white wall. White, white, nothing. When the voices worked their way into her dreamless sleep, she'd first thought they belonged to Austin and Rick, but one was too high, the other too deep. And then, suddenly, the door opened and she froze. The higher-pitched voice sounded like an old man. She couldn't understand him easily, thanks to the blankets over her head, combined with his thick accent, but the other voice gave her chills, like some sexy vampire purring over her shoulder from behind. It didn't matter what he said, a word or two, that was all, but she was dying to get a look at him, if only to put her imagination to rest. "I expect no one." Brief and cryptic. "Thank ye, kindly." Finally, the old man left, but then she was horrified by how excited she was. That deep throat was still there. It was stupid of her, really, when she should have been putting every ounce of energy into praying the guy would leave too, so she could get dressed and get the heck out of Dodge. The minutes ticked by with no sound in the house, only the start of an engine and that sound fading. Finally, a few distant footsteps. Then, nothing. Had the guy gone outside? The reality of the situation shocked her into action. She was alone with a strange man in a house she'd broken into, and she was lying in his bed in little more than a slip.
I don't think so.
As quietly as she could, she slipped off the edge of the mattress, stepped over to the chair, and picked up the edge of her skirt. She started climbing up through the dress, intending to have it fall into place without the need for help. After all, she'd chosen that dress because of the long ribbons she could use to zip herself into it. She had no idea that Austin's sister would finally be nice enough to offer a hand at the last minute. It was just too bad she hadn't stayed with Chelsea until it was time to walk down the aisle. If she had, Rick wouldn't have been able to ruin her day and her life.
Don't think about it now, you idiot. This is no time to cry.
"Begging your pardon, lass." That deep voice rumbled through the room and seemed to echo in the rafters. Or was it her bones? "I considered leaving the house to ye, but then wondered if perhaps you're in need of saving, aye? And here I find ye hoisted on your own petard, as it were. Do you need a hand, then?" The thick seam of the dress's waist caught across her open mouth, but she spoke anyway.
Just a little privacy, please.
"Privacy?" He chuckled, and the vibrations of it nearly shattered her. "If you're certain."
Uh-huh.
No way would she try talking again. She wasn't going to move either. For the moment, the huge skirt covered her important parts, and she'd rather stand there with both her arms sticking out the top of the dress, like a couple of sock puppets, than risk it all falling into a puddle at her feet while he watched. "As you wish." The door clicked shut. She waited for a few seconds, listening for the sound of his breathing.
Who am I kidding? My ears are covered with satin.
She managed to get the rope-like seam out of her mouth and down past her chin, but then the zipper caught on her updo.
Expensive zippers had no business catching on hair.
She growled, then pulled the dress back off a bit, turned her head, and tried again. She felt a slight adjustment to her hair that had nothing to do with the movement of the dress, and she froze. The guy was still there, standing close enough to touch her.
Better to face him with a dress on and half bald than to face him in my underwear, right?
So she braced herself for pain, pulled her arms and elbows through the holes, then forced the bodice down over her boobs. Miraculously, her hair never caught. She reached behind her skull to see how bad the damage was, and turned. but no one was there. However, a mouse soft click of the door handle told her she hadn't been imagining it. Either that, or the place was haunted. Chapter 5. Alexander paced back and forth along the hearth and wondered which woman would appear first, the lass from the bedchamber or the wee witch. He'd performed some noble deeds already, helping the lass get free of the metal teeth of a hungry zipper, sparing her dignity while doing so, and leaving her untouched when she had obviously meant to waylay him in his own bed. He was only grateful she'd kept her shift on. It had been a surprise to find her with a modern wedding gown at the ready. He'd thought such machinations to gain a husband had ceased long ago. He strode to the cottage door and pushed the curtain aside. The empty drive was slowly losing its shade as the sun climbed towards its zenith, but there was no sign of a lass in a black robe or a green ring of light headed his way. His actions were by no measure heroic, but just the same, it was a noble thing to walk away. However, since Sonny did not deign to show herself, the acts of a gentleman apparently didn't qualify. The floor creaked, and he turned to find the lass bedecked in her white gown stepping out from the bedchamber. His fingers tingled at the memory of her soft, rich brown hair. When their gazes met, she stopped moving and swallowed. It was a long moment before she smiled. The room lit up instantly.
I'm sorry. I hope I didn't freak you out.
American, then. I'm nae the sort to freak out, lass. From across the room he discerned a shiver pass through her, but he dared not offer her comfort until he knew why she'd come. Other than losing a battle with a zipper, the lass seemed capable enough. She was beautiful, not fragile, and he doubted she was there because she needed a warrior to rescue her. Thus, if she wasn't in some sort of danger, she must be trying to seduce him into marriage, as he'd first suspected. Are you a child? He looked to her midsection and gestured with his chin. Is that why you would attempt to seduce a man before you've even set eyes on him? Her frown of confusion turned to that of displeasure.
Are you kidding me?
Her mouth opened and closed a few more times while she looked about the room as if searching for the words to continue. Finally, she found them.
You think I broke in here to seduce you?
She grunted, and the sound of it was quite charming, he had to admit, like a small animal throwing a tantrum. It was a pity, truly, that the lass didn't need his aid, for he could clearly imagine her throwing her arms round his neck and bestowing her heartfelt gratitude on his lips. And he was tempted to remind her that he'd not only helped her with the zipper, he'd kept her presence a secret from the proprietor. But at the moment, gratitude was likely the last thing she was feeling toward him after his tactless accusation. Forgive me, lass. I should have allowed you to explain before I made assumptions. Can you forgive me, then? Her indignation subsided and she nodded. It was a fine woman who could forgive easily. A familiar noise grew in the distance, and the woman panicked. Her eyes widened, and she appeared to be genuinely frightened.
I'm not here.
She said, and waved her hands out in front of her.
Just, please, I'm not here.
She turned and disappeared back into the bedroom and closed the door with a boom. Alexander's heart danced a wee jig then, given the renewed hope that the lass might be needing his help after all. At the moment, if someone asked him if he would prefer a kiss from the lovely lass to a few moments to vent his spleen with bonny Prince Charlie, he couldn't say which he would prefer. The only explanation that offered itself was that he was easily charmed after so many years of speaking to no woman save young Sansaray, and before Culloden. Well, he'd best forget all that. He walked outside to clear his head a bit, for surely his imagination had grown cagey from being indoors so long at a go, and judging from the lass's reaction, she might need protection from whoever was approaching on a utility vehicle. Alexander had a grand ear for car engines, and whatever was headed down the road in his direction sounded much like the Cushman utility buggy driven on Culloden's grounds by the security guards. The small set of steps off the wee porch were made of a material that resembled wood but felt foreign to his hand. Though the surface was by no means smooth, there were no slivers in his palm after he ran his hand along the railings. Impressive, but how would it fare against the winter weather of the Highlands? He stomped a foot, and though the steps shook, they were sturdily built. The pleasant surprise came with the realization that Sansaray, bless her, hadn't left him defenceless after all. The weight of his skein dhu shook against his ankle to let him know it was there. And the handy thing about the wee dagger in his sock was that he could use it to make other weapons. With some unknown calamity due to arrive some time in the next few minutes, or at least the next 2 days, he determined there was no time to waste and set about searching the edges of the yard for a sturdy branch. All the while, he watched the drive, of course. He had just freed a straight limb from a tree when a strange sight appeared at the bottom of the hill. The buggy was expected. The 2 men riding inside it were not. They were dressed in morning suits instead of guard uniforms. The vehicle rolled to a stop in the same spot the old man had used. Both men dismounted and headed up the incline on foot. As they neared, Alexander could immediately identify which man was the more likely threat, the one on the left, whose eyes narrowed even as he smiled. The other man was taller, of a size with Alexander, but there was nothing threatening about him. He sliced off a bit of bark and sent it flying to land at the feet of the dangerous one, and both men stopped. 10 feet still separated them. "Good morning," said the taller one. "Good morning." He sliced off another slab of bark before giving the man his attention. "I'm Austin. This is my friend, Rick. We're sorry to bother you, but we're looking for—" He rubbed a hand across his face. He was clearly uncomfortable, and there was a redness to his eyes. "Well, we're trying to find my fiancée. We were supposed to get married this morning, but it looks like she got cold feet." He waved both hands defensively. "Not that there's anything wrong with her getting cold feet, of course, but she ran off, no car, probably still in her wedding dress, and I just don't want her getting hurt out here in these woods, you know?" Alexander hid his surprise and disappointment in the woman hiding in the house and played the part of a simple huntsman. "Aye, a lass alone in the woods wouldn't fare well for long, I would think." "So you haven't seen her?" The other man looked relieved, but his eyes kept darting to the door of the cottage. "I've only just arrived," Alexander said. "I checked the house a moment ago. I'm afraid you'll need to continue your search." The tall one nodded. "Thanks anyway. Sorry to bother you." His demeanour was clearly dejected, as any man's would be, after being left at the altar as he appeared to have been. Alexander would have invited the man in for a drink of wine and some commiseration, but under the circumstances he still felt compelled to protect the woman in spite of what she'd done. "No bother," Alexander said. "A pity about the lass. I hope she's found safe." The groom nodded and headed back down the hill. His friend took one last look at the cottage, windows and all, then stepped close, ignoring the end of the branch held between them. "Look," he said, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small card and offered it. "If you do see her, I want you to call me at this number, and I'll make sure you get a nice finder's fee. Got it?" Alexander took the card only because he expected the man to keep at him until he did, but he said nothing. "Look," the man said again. "This is the first house in 2 miles of the castle, so unless ye find a ride on a road that has had no traffic all morning, I'm sure she stopped here. If you've got her in there, fine. Just have her call someone and let them know she's all right, so Austin can stop looking for her. He doesn't deserve this." "No man deserves such betrayal," Alexander said, more to himself than to the troublesome man before him. "So you don't deny it?" "Deny what?" He looked askance at Alexander. Though they spoke the same language, there always seemed to be a breakdown in communication between Scots and Yanks, and this time it seemed to work to Alexander's advantage. "Well, if you see her," the man said, uncertain again, "make sure you call me, okay? Don't call anyone at the castle. I don't want the Forbes family bothered with her inappropriate behavior ever again." "Understood," Alexander said, and went back to sharpening his new weapon. It wouldn't surprise him if, when all was said and done, he found the need to use it on the fellow before him. The fellow assessed the cottage again. "What is this, a hunting lodge?" Alexander watched a chip fly off to the right. "Today it is." "And what are you hunting? Wild boar?" Alexander sent another slice at the man. This one hit him just over his heart. "Nay, not today." The small pucker between that one's eyes said he was confused again, though Alexander supposed the man would understand the threat after he took some time to ponder their exchange. And when he did understand, he suspected this Rick to come back. Until then, he would continue to play the innocent. "Have a fine day," he said casually. Rick studied his expressionless face for a moment, nodded, and turned away. But Alexander didn't go back inside the cottage. He continued to prepare his new weapon, because although one possible adversary was gone, fading in the distance with the sound of the buggy, there was still another enemy waiting inside the house. Chapter 6. Chelsea listened to the whine of the golf cart move up past the cottage and slowly fade into silence. But still, she didn't dare move. The glass doors of the shower were frosted, and looking in, her white dress would blend with the white walls, so it wasn't a completely stupid place for her to hide. But one thing was for sure, she wasn't about to hide in that guy's bed again. She could just imagine the snide comments Rick would have made if he found her there, not to mention what Austin would think.
Austin.
Her heart twisted like someone was holding it over the sink, trying to wring out every drop so they could hang it on the edge of a counter to dry. Every breath hurt. Every thought was a kick in the gut.
What have I done to Austin?
It was too painful to think about. She'd never get out of this guy's house and get back home if she curled up into a ball and wept like she wanted to. So she had to concentrate on something else. She had to think about Rick and how she might ensure Austin knew who had really ruined their wedding. No matter what Rick had to say, no matter what lies he told, she held on to the hope that one day his story would have one too many holes. He couldn't keep looking out like he did. One day his hatred of her would slip out, and Austin would realize his twisted friend would have done anything to keep her away from him. Sadly, though, Austin never seemed to recognize that Rick protected him like he did, not out of love or loyalty, but out of defense of his own ambition. He wanted Austin to run for Congress one day because he wanted to hitchhike on his coattails. He wanted to share in Austin's glory without the need to do any work for it, just like he'd done all their lives. And Rick was too ugly, deep down under his pleasant face, to ever go far himself. And if he did try to run for office, ever, Chelsea would make it her personal mission in life to make sure he never won an election.
Way to go, Rick. You've got a bitter enemy for life.
He could have settled for second place, allowed Chelsea to marry Austen and take first, and would have still had Austen's friendship and political connections. Chelsea would have never ruined their friendship if it meant hurting Austen to do it. But not anymore. Somehow she'd make sure Austen got a good look at the snake standing next to him, and it would all be over. Rick probably thought she would run home and lick her wounds, and one day look back at the fairy tale she'd almost lived, but she couldn't allow someone that ruthless, that hateful, to remain so close to the man she loved, the man she still loved. Had it only been hours since hope had been a living, breathing thing in her life? She sucked air into her lungs and reminded herself that she was still alive, and that she needed to stay that way, even if her heart had taken sick leave. She had to get to the airport, change her ticket, and get home. When she was safely behind her locked door, she would finally be able to deal with the hurt. Thank goodness she'd taken 2 seconds to grab her purse with her passport, or she'd have no choice but to tuck her tail between her legs and go back to the castle grounds. Finally, she couldn't take the chill of the shower tile any longer and summoned the courage to leave the bathroom and face reality again. The Scotsman wasn't in the bedroom, for which she was grateful. That was a vision she didn't need haunting her for the rest of her life. A Highlander in a kilt, with broad shoulders and long, dark hair, standing next to a large, inviting bed. He wasn't in the living room or kitchen either, so she carefully peeked out through the sheer curtains over a window and saw movement. The guy was whittling a giant stick, and the little pieces of wood flying from the end of the knife were the only things moving in the yard. No one else. No one she needed to hide from. So she tucked her purse under her arm, pushed the door open, and stepped onto the landing. She was trying to choose her words carefully, but she got distracted by the bulge of his triceps as he gripped the heavy branch under one arm and carved with the other. His shirt sleeves were rolled up high, and the muscles he'd been hiding looked like something on the cover of a fitness magazine. Sweat had just begun to dampen the hair at his left temple and drip along his jaw. Whatever she'd hoped to say was forgotten. She might have watched him for 5 minutes straight before he noticed she was there, or at least he pretended to just be noticing her. With the noisy swish of tulle and chiffon sliding against satin, she couldn't move quietly, but after getting a look at the scowl on his face, she realized he might have been deep in thought and really hadn't noticed her step outside.
So,
She began. So, he repeated, then ignored her and turned back to his project.
did someone come looking for me?
Aye, he said. The man ye promised to marry, Austen, was it? Aye, a man with a broken spirit, if ever I've seen one.
Broken spirit.
Austen's name, said aloud, brought tears to her eyes. The rest was a punch in the gut. It took a painful swallow before she could reply.
But he wasn't alone, was he?
Nay, an unpleasant fellow came along.
Rick?
Aye, Rick had a message for ye. Rick, but no message from Austen. He prefers you make a telephone call and let folks ken you're safe so they can stop searching for ye. She finally noticed how violently the brawny man was whittling. If he wasn't careful, he might cut himself. Small chips of wood went flying 6 feet away, but the pile around his feet proved the violence was a recent development. Obviously, he was angry, and if he was feeling so sorry for Austen, he had to be angry with her. But she wasn't going to bother explaining herself. She felt stupid enough for falling into Rick's trap, and now she wasn't sure the worm hadn't been right. If Austen would have come to the back of the chapel, she was pretty sure he would have convinced her that marrying him was the right thing to do, and everything would have been fine. But the question was, for how long would it have been fine? A broken spirit now, or a broken dream later. She'd been hoping that nothing would have to break if she just ran fast enough and far enough, but that had been stupid too.
Um,
She began, to get the Scots' attention again.
I'm sorry if all this has ruined your morning. I'll get out of here and hopefully you can pretend I was never here.
She walked down the steps and turned her head to face him as she headed down the drive.
I appreciate you covering for me.
I did not lie for you, lass. Even when he raised his voice, it was deep enough to rattle the leaves, or maybe it was just a stray breeze that gave her another chill. She stumbled to a stop and faced him.
You didn't?
Nay, I only said that they would need to keep searching. What they concluded was their own business, though that Rick fella was fairly certain ye were inside.
But not Austin?
Nay, I suppose he's not the suspicious sort. She laughed lightly, because the guy had nailed it on the head.
No, Austin is too trusting.
Aren't most men, until they are betrayed. After a pointed look at her dress, he concentrated on his whittling again. Betrayed. It sounded so horrible to phrase it that way when deep down she'd been so sure she was saving him from a future he didn't really want. But no, that wasn't the truth. Deep down, she'd been saving herself, hurting Austin before he had a chance to hurt her to her face. Or worse, keep his disappointment to himself for the rest of their lives.
Well,
She said, forcing a smile.
let's hope he won't be so trusting next time, right?
She turned back to the slope and concentrated on her footing. Her heels made the angle much worse than it was, and she couldn't decide between walking on the rocks or the grass down the centre.
Thanks again.
She said, then scooted to the left, hoping the gravel would give more traction if she slipped. If she fell, she would try to land on the soft grass that ran along the outside edge between her and the wall of high bushes, blocking her view of the forest beyond. Somewhere behind her, a large piece of wood bounced hard against the ground and made a strange ringing sound, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. She turned to see an angry Scottish god bearing down on her, and she quickly stepped backward. The satin off her slight train was pinned beneath her heel. She lost her balance and landed on her butt. He reached out to catch her, but their hands never connected, and his fleeting concern turned back into a scowl, like it was her fault she'd fallen. "That's all you have to say for yourself," he grunted. "That ye hope he's learnt his lesson. That ye have no care that the man will likely never trust another woman again. Ye hope for it." He shook his head, disbelieving. "Have all women become the vixens we've seen on the telly?" It wasn't his words that made her tremble, though they made her feel pretty guilty. And it wasn't the fact that he was practically yelling at her when he didn't really know why she'd run away from her own wedding. She already knew what a fool she was. But the passionate god looming over her was absolutely beautiful. His hair flew out behind him like some wind machine was blowing in his face. His powerful jaw jumped beneath his dark, tan cheeks, and for a second she wondered if he was actually going to wring her neck. And no matter how dangerous the situation seemed, she couldn't help wondering how many thousands of women flocked to Scotland every year for a one-in-a-million chance encounter like this with a passionate man in a kilt. But probably none of those women had come to the country intending to marry the knight in shining armour they'd sat next to on the airplane. Too bad Austin was never that passionate about anything. In fact, their only arguments had been pretty one-sided because Austin never got mad. He was reasonable. He was wise. He was wonderful. And she couldn't imagine anything she could do that would send him into such a rant, or loom over her while he lectured. No, Austin would never be a danger to her, not like this guy. And she wasn't imagining it out of a sense of her own guilt. He was genuinely pissed.
Where is that knife he was whittling with anyway?
The romantic image, complete with the kilt-wearing hero, suddenly dissipated like a morning fog when the sun came up out over the ocean. But it wasn't the sun chasing the haze away, it was a real threat. This angry stranger could drag her inside and chop her up into little pieces without anyone being the wiser, because the only man on earth who suspected where she was just happened to be her mortal enemy who never wanted to see her again anyway. She had to get out of there, or that airline ticket would never be used. Chelsea Marie Chase from Boston, Mass, would never be heard from again, and as Rick pushed Emily into Austin's arms, he'd whisper in his ear not to worry about Chelsea. She'd probably thrown herself into a loch and drowned, just as mentally unstable as her addict parents had been.
Nope, not going to happen.
She looked up at the Scot and raised her hand, inviting him to pull her to her feet. It was clear she would never be able to get off her dress and stand, with him looming over her like he was.
Do you mind? This dress costs more than I can make in 3 months.
He glanced at her, then his face cleared, as if he was just realizing what a bully he was being. He wrapped his hand around her thumb and wrist and pulled, and she pulled. Only, as she did so, she pressed one bare foot against his rock-hard calf and yanked him off balance. As he fell, she only had to guide him over her head and let him land in the prickly bushes behind her. A surprised grunt was the only sound she heard as she grabbed her shoes and purse and started sprinting down the strip of grass that ran down the center of the drive.
Never mess with a waitress.
Chapter 7. 5 feet from the end of the drive, Chelsea had to decide which way to turn. If she went back down the road, she'd end up at the castle, where she would have to face the music. But at least she could gather her things and get a ride to the airport. She also wouldn't have to walk past the cottage again and maybe face a guy she'd thrown into the brambles. If she took the sharp angle to the right and continued up and over the hill, she wouldn't have to face Rick again. And when she did face Austin, it was not going to be with the worm in the room. Denial still felt like the right thing to do, so she slowed down to make the drastic turn. The crunch of gravel startled her, and she turned to look over her shoulder. "Never mess with a Highlander," he growled, then reached for her shoulder. She squealed and spun her shoulder away, which had her running backward into the road and tripping on her skirt again. That time, as she was falling, she gave up any hope of getting money back for the dress. The Scot reached out to catch her, but he failed again, pulling his hand back and wincing like he'd jammed it into something. She did what was necessary to keep from turning her back on him while she got to her feet and gathered her things, but thankfully he'd taken a step back. "Forgive me, lass. I frightened ye. It was instinct, I suppose, that had me chasing after ye." He spoke gently enough, but his eyebrows were still slammed together, and his eyes moved back and forth, like he was searching the trees for something he didn't trust. "I'll not harm ye," he said, then went back to searching the trees. But the real kicker was when he reached out and touched empty air in front of him, prodding it like some mime, like he was being contained in an invisible box. She carefully lifted her skirts high enough to get her train off the ground and took a few more steps backward. She'd seen some crazy acts on the streets of Edinburgh a couple of days before, but there was absolutely no doubt in her mind this guy was not acting. His cheese had definitely slipped off his cracker. He slid one of his boots forward, and it stopped abruptly where the drive ended and the road began. "Just like Culloden," he mumbled, then started prodding the air above the spot where his boot had stopped. She took another step. His attention shot to her, and she jumped and started backing quickly down the road. The castle was going to be the safest place for her after all. No matter how embarrassed she was, she would face Austin that day rather than risk this guy following her up the longer road to town. At least there would be people at the castle. "What's your name, lass?"
Uh,
The little voice inside her head warned her to lie.
Chelsea.
He nodded and held up his hands like he was surrendering. "I'll not harm ye, Chelsea, and I've not gone mad. There is a barrier I cannot breach, so I'll come no closer." She couldn't help snorting.
A barrier? Like a force field? Look, I'm just gonna get out of here and leave you alone, okay?
He sighed. "Aye, lass, do what you must. Far be it from me to advise another to fight instinct, aye." His smile was a half grimace. "It was lovely speaking to a woman again, and being spoken to. I thank ye, and I hope ye can overlook my poor manners. It's been a long while since I've needed any, and I'm afeard I let my thoughts escape through my mouth." He went back to prodding the air, and Chelsea saw it as a sign to move faster. But just as she was about to turn and run, he picked up a handful of dirt, spit on it, then threw it onto the road. Only it never made it to the road. She didn't remember making a conscious choice to stop, or to start walking back. It was just an automatic response, like passing a darling pair of shoes in a shop window and finding yourself staring down at them, wondering if they have your size. She pointed where the dirt had landed.
Would you mind doing that again?
He studied her for a minute, bit his lip for another 10 seconds, then bent and scooped up a little rock. He turned away to spit on it, but it was always in sight. Then he pulled back his hand and tossed it, underhand, toward the road. There was no sound when it suddenly stopped and fell straight down to the ground, landing and rolling to a stop right at the edge of the driveway. She met his gaze.
Why the spit?
He shrugged, picked up another pebble and tossed it. This time it landed on the other side of the road and thumped against the low stone wall that might have been built hundreds of years ago. "A barrier," he said. "I am not allowed to leave this place, nor any part of me, it would seem. Just like the place I came from."
You said Culloden, as in Culloden Moor?
"Aye," he said softly.
Is there, like, a prison there or something? A mental institution?
She realized how rude she was being, but it was too late to take the words back. He snorted then. "I'm nae mental, lass." Then he lifted both his shoulders again, held them, then dropped them. "Or mayhap I am."
Mayhap?
"'Tis a long story, lass. Best be on your way." He shooed her away with his fingers. "You're clearly able to save yourself when needed, so it was likely not intended that my destiny and yours intertwine after all. I was never meant to be your hero, aye. But perhaps you'll have a pleasant thought for me now and again, when you remember your time in bonny Scotland." He put fingers to his temple in a mock salute. "Alexander Fraser, miss, at your service. Like I've said, it's been a pleasure." The guy gave her a little bow, then gave up tossing rocks and started back up the drive. And though she wasn't really hoping to see anything inappropriate, she couldn't help but watch the back of his kilt swinging forward and back as he went, tapping lightly against the back of his thighs. When he passed from view, she peeked around the edge of the bushes that grew 10 feet high between the drive and the road, creating a long hallway with the bushes on the other side. He collected the branch he'd carved into a giant pencil, then took it inside the house. He then turned and lifted it over the door, probably propping it over the curtain rods above the windows to either side. When his gaze lowered, he noticed her and gave her a sad little wave. Then he disappeared. She turned back toward the road and realized she had to make that decision all over again. And this time, there was no rush to decide which way to go. and when the little voice in her head suggested she go back, she knew that voice hadn't been referring to the castle. Chapter 8. Alexander had done something he would have never thought himself capable. After decades of resenting the romance novelists, those who had lured impressionable women to Culloden in hopes of a glimpse of something resembling a certain Fraser character, he'd stooped to using the same tactics to lure the lass back to the cottage. She didn't seem particularly impressionable, but he was always surprised by which of Culloden's female visitors would produce a tear or two while standing before the Clan Fraser stone. For all he knew, those women had been moved by the Fraser soldiers who had truly perished in the battle, but he had his doubts. After all, it was the Fraser stone that continually had flowers lying on the ground before it, and though other graves were honoured regularly, there was no comparison. It had been pitiful, truly, to be unable to appreciate the place of his own clan in that famous but fictional world. But as he stood there, waiting for the lovely fish to take the bait, the bitterness washed away, and he wondered if perhaps he'd been jealous of that Fraser character all those years. And perhaps romance novelists knew something he hadn't, the way to a lass's heart. A pity he hadn't known in his own day how to keep a certain lass's affection. It seemed this Chelsea, as well as being a capable woman, was also the stubborn sort. He waited nearly half an hour for her to come back up the drive. His senses told him she was still out there deliberating, or perhaps she was the proud sort and wouldn't return unless she had a reasonable excuse to do so. Would he have to swallow his own pride and go invite her back? He couldn't imagine what Sansaray had in mind when she'd placed him there and left a barrier around the place to ensure he stayed put. In any case, he would be unable to drum up any true act of heroism while sitting alone in a cottage, drinking wine, and dining on chicken someone else had cooked for him. Clearly, others would need to be involved. And the lass had been all but dropped in his lap. He should have kept her inside. When he'd gone tumbling arse over tea kettle into the bushes, he'd only given a heartbeat's notice to the sting of the thorns. He'd panicked when he thought his one chance to prove himself was getting away, and after realizing he wouldn't be able to catch her, contained as he was, he'd had to stoop to whatever means were available to him to bring her back again. He had to admit that feeling the lass's gaze upon him as he'd made his way up the rise and into the house had lent a bit of puff to his chest. It had been a good long while since anyone had appreciated his form, let alone a beauty like Chelsea. He sighed and stood, brushing the dust from the hearth from his backside and preparing his belly for some humble pie. But then he heard the low hum of a weak engine, perhaps the Cushman utility buggy returning from over the hill, and he smiled, realizing he wouldn't have to eat that bitter pie after all. Standing at the back of the room, he noticed the white of her dress when she neared the top of the rise. She wore her shoes again, obviously no longer worried about fleeing from him. By the time she knocked upon the door, the buggy was growing near.
Mr. Fraser!
She called quietly through the screen of the door.
Mr. Fraser!
He paused from stacking wood on the grate and said, without looking her way, "You've broken in before, lass. Why let a thin door stop you now?" She paused not at all and threw the screen wide, then pulled it shut behind her and closed the larger door besides. He stood to face her just as she finished with the locks. She began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "No need to explain, aye. Hide where you will, and when they've moved on, we'll find some food." She gave him a relieved smile, then started for the bedchamber. But she stopped and laid her hand on his forearm.
Thank you.
She gave his arm a squeeze, then hurried away. And while the buggy drove past the house, He stared at the spot where his flesh still showed the imprint of her hand. A minute later, there was a firm knock on the door. He chuckled to himself as he unlocked all the latches and chains, but he sobered quickly when the one called Rick faced him alone. "Found her, did ye?" Alexander asked. The man frowned. "We didn't." Then he tried to look past Alexander, but he was nigh onto a door himself, not easy to see around. "Pity," he said. "Unless you'd rather not find her, of course." The canny man understood and narrowed his eyes. "He just wanted me to check one more time," he said, then turned aside to give Alexander a clear view of a distraught groom seated in the vehicle, looking both hopeful and forlorn. Rick shook his head at his friend, and the poor lad bit his lip and looked away. "See what she's done to him?" "As I said, pity." Alexander offered nothing more and stood his ground, even though Rick looked past his shoulder and made the smallest feint, expecting him to at least take a step back. But he was no fool to be easily manipulated by a scunner like that. "Better luck to your friend," he said, then leaned forward slightly. The man stepped back, then adopted an amiable smile. "Sorry to bother you again," he said loudly for his audience in the cart. "You've got my number if you see her." "Aye," he said. "Godspeed," he called to the groom, who then gave a kind wave. As soon as the cart moved into the road, Alexander turned to find a weepy woman at his back.
Did you see him?
"Aye, he's a pitiful mess, lass. Would you like me to call him back? Or rather, do you have a mobile in your purse? I can hardly go collect the man, since it canna seem to leave, but perhaps ye can dial a number, and I can ask him to come. You wouldn't need to speak to him yet, if you're not ready."
A mess?
He nodded. Pitiful. And his own chest constricted, knowing the lass was weeping over another man. It stirred up memories that he would rather leave buried on the moor, and he had to turn away from her to stop the rest from flooding in. "I promised ye food, did I not? And a generous Mr. Muir arranged for a bottle of wine and a roasted fowl. If you'll sit to the table, I'll see what manners I might be able to summon from the past." Yes, manners, not memories. Thankfully, he was occupied with domestic details for the time being, and when he had time to think, he was careful to keep those thoughts on the woman he was there to help. He hurried a bit, since there was a chance he had already helped her enough by simply keeping that Rick character away from her twice. And if his duty was finished, he wanted a chance to taste the food and the wine before the wee witch came to gather him up and take him away. And it was for that reason he snuck a few mouthfuls of chicken and half a glass of wine while he moved about the kitchen area making his preparations. "Elbows from the table, if you please," he said. He handed her a small box of tissues to occupy her hands while he spread a cloth. Then he returned with plates, wineglasses, and utensils. He set them out as he remembered, then plucked the tissue box away again. "No more tears until the meal is finished, do you ken?"
Aye,
she said, grinning with damp cheeks. It took all his fortitude not to bend and reward her with a kiss. He gave her a frown for tempting him, but she continued to grin. He shook his head and went back for the food. Upon a long platter he placed one of the roasted chickens. To one side he positioned tomatoes, and on the other some of the mushrooms he'd sliced and cooked briefly in a pan with butter and garlic. His bungling fingers had ruined them, but he would serve them just the same. When he returned to the table, those lovely cheeks were dry once more, and the smile was less obligatory. "You'll have to forgive the mushrooms. I spilled a tin of parsley flakes all over them. If you'd care for the recipe, I call them mushrooms in parsley mud." Her laugh was delightful and caught him off guard. It bubbled around him like music amplified on speakers, and he winced, suddenly pained by all that her laughter implied. He was sitting down to dinner with a woman who belonged to another man, tempted to kiss another man's woman, a man who mourned the loss of her while Alexander prepared her meal and cajoled laughter from her. He had no right. "Excuse me, lass, I suddenly dunna feel so well, and I need a bit of air." He avoided her concerned gaze. "Eat up, I've not cooked for naught, aye. But if the mushrooms go untouched, I'll not feel slighted, you have my word." He stepped into the living room and scrubbed his face with his hands. A second later he was out in the fresh air, determined to think of nothing more than identifying the limits of his barrier. Then he'd find the point farthest from the cottage door and spend some time there, not thinking about the bride inside. Chapter 9. Chelsea was starving. It was the only excuse she could think of for diving into a meal prepared by a stranger, drinking some of the wine from a bottle that had already been opened, and ingesting both the chicken and the wine after the stranger who prepared it suddenly came up with an excuse not to have any himself. She was going to die. She wiped grease from her fingers onto the plaid napkin and sat perfectly still for a minute, trying to notice the second the drug started taking effect. Then she waited another. Her stomach felt, to be honest, it felt relieved that there was finally some food in it. She'd been way too nervous that morning to eat anything, and the little drink of orange juice had burned more than it soothed. So yeah, she'd been starving. The wine was strong, so she hadn't had much. If the Scot had drugged the bottle, she obviously hadn't had enough to affect her. She didn't drink often, so she was always careful not to overdo it. This time, it might have saved her life. Only she didn't feel funny. The wine barely warmed her throat. That was it.
Okay, 2 more minutes, and if I feel okay, I'm eating a miniature tomato and a little more chicken.
She didn't last another minute. He'd promised he wouldn't harm her, and she had believed him. As she ate the meat off the second leg, she started feeling guilty for enjoying the food at all when he was clearly in distress. Reluctantly, she put the chicken back on her plate and cleaned her fingers again. She was just going to have to wait until they could eat together. She paused at the door to listen for the golf cart, but heard nothing. And the entire time she'd been inside, only 2 real cars had passed the cottage. For all she knew, Austin and Rick and the entire wedding party might have left the castle and gone on with their touring plans. And if Rick stayed true to form, he'd either be running around with Austin on their honeymoon itinerary, or he'd drag Austin off to France and the rest of Europe. And wouldn't Austin be surprised when Erica Winston just happened to be joining them? It was all so ridiculous. She should have never run off. Never let the bastard win. She should have marched up the aisle, grabbed Austin's hand, and hauled him out of there for some privacy. All she'd needed was a little assurance that he really did want her more than he wanted a career in politics. It was a conversation they'd had a dozen times, but she'd just needed to hear it once more, and then she would have been fine, wouldn't she? She held onto the door jamb and tried to tell whether it was emotion or poison that made her question her own reasoning. Or maybe it was the distraction of the Scottish magician who was able to make it seem like he could change the trajectory of a rock after it left his hand. She had tried for nearly half an hour to recreate what he'd done, but she couldn't do it. In the end, she figured he had to have been using a mirror or a piece of glass she never saw. Who knew what a man could hide beneath one of those kilts, or in the folds of material draped over his chest? Or maybe it was that chest that distracted her. Holy cow, if she looked at him for too long, he took her breath away, and with it, some much-needed oxygen. She took a deep breath to prove she could, then went looking for the Scottish heartthrob the rest of the world may or may not have discovered yet. There was no use worrying too much about the dress. Either it could be cleaned well enough for another bride to wear it, or it couldn't. All she had to do was keep from snagging it on some gnarly-looking bushes, and there would still be hope. Luckily, the lower plants had lots of yellow blossoms on them, warning her to stay away. She was careful to stick to the centre of a path that wound around the side of the cottage and down into a ravine behind. She was so absorbed by keeping her dress away from the branches, she hadn't noticed what she'd walked into until she was smack dab in the middle of it.
A fairy glen.
Or at least, if there were such things as fairy glens, she was standing in one. The ravine was covered by a high umbrella of tiny leaves that only let the mildest light through them, and the trees themselves were covered with a thin layer of bright spring green moss that looked like it had been sprayed on like a coat of paint. She could almost imagine tiny winged figures flitting around with miniature paint sprayers, making the world match their favourite colour. Like so many scraps of delicate, fragile lace, a lovely species of moss draped from branch to branch, and in places morning dew still dripped and clung, waiting for a sharp point of light to burst its glistening bubble. The water of a small creek percolated between rocks that had also been sprayed by the fairies, and sitting on a bank of thick, soft ferns sat the Highlander, picking pebbles out from under the fronds and tossing them into the water. As far as she could tell, he had no magic trick set up. Clearly, he wasn't expecting her to find him.
No force field on this side of the house, huh?
He started and turned with his hand raised, then relaxed when he saw it was her. "The barrier. 'Tis over to the left there," he said. She rolled her eyes, but he didn't notice. When she stepped closer, however, he seemed leery. A big man like him, afraid of her.
I promise not to toss you over my shoulder again.
He smiled at the joke, but it wasn't convincing.
Then what's the matter? Do you really not feel well?
She reached forward on instinct to touch his forehead and check for a fever. Maybe it was just a female instinct, but he flinched. She straightened and stepped back, feeling like a leper. "I'm not unwell," he confessed, and she started worrying about the whole poison scenario again.
Then what's wrong?
He pivoted away from her as he stood, and she resisted the urge to sniff her armpits. If she stunk after running 2 miles in a wedding gown, she shouldn't have been surprised. "What is wrong, lass, is that you're the betrothed of another man, and I should keep my distance, aye." She exhaled more than just the air in her lungs. She felt her entire body deflate with the realization that she had given up that fiancé status, and now she was just someone's ex.
That's funny.
She said, trying to keep her tone light.
I don't feel like I belong to anyone anymore.
His right brow rose into a high peak. "Truly?" She shrugged and sighed again.
Truly.
A slow grin spread across his face, and she stepped to the side, prepared to hustle up out of the ravine if necessary. But he waved his fingers. "Come." Then he pointed to the bed of ferns he'd crushed flat. "Sit beside me and listen to the water for a mite. 'Tis a magic place, is it not?" She nodded and stepped onto the ferns, relieved he hadn't tried to throw her over his shoulder and carry her into the house like some barbarian. She was also eager to move closer to him, just to prove to herself that it wasn't the smell of her that made him back away. She sat carefully and smoothed her skirts like she was getting ready for a photo. He plopped down beside her, his thigh pressed close to hers, and his kilt spilling onto the white satin. And while she tried not to overreact to both those facts, he dug through the leaves on his left and came up with some rocks. He held them out to her on his hand, like he was offering hors d'oeuvres. "Go ahead, lass. Tossing rocks in the water is good for the soul, and besides, they weigh much less than a man, aye." She laughed and took a stone, then tilted her head and narrowed her eyes at him.
Where did you say that barrier was?
He bit his lip for a minute, and she completely forgot time and place until he finally released it. His arm rose, and he pointed to a path that rose up the far bank and disappeared between two trees. Over there, lass. I've already tasted it. She grinned and held up the little stone.
Here, spit on this.
She looked him in the eye, daring him to refuse. He studied her for a second or two. His cheeks dimpled, and she knew she had him. She had to bite her own lip to keep from grinning like an idiot. And after he stared at her lip like she'd stared at his, he wrapped his hand around hers and pulled the stone close. But instead of spitting on it, he licked it. She snapped her mouth shut when she realized it was hanging open. Then she hauled back and chucked the rock, aiming as well as she could for the space he'd pointed to. It flew straighter than she even hoped, but before it passed between the trees, it shot straight down to the ground and bounced in the dirt before rolling backward and landing unceremoniously in the creek. Chelsea jumped to her feet and hurried down to the water. A quick glance over her shoulder proved he wasn't trying to follow. Her skirts had to be held high to keep them dry, but she found enough sturdy stones to make her way across the stream without slipping in. Her shoes left prints on the stones where they had crushed the moss, and a fleeting twinge of guilt for destroying even the thinnest layer of fairy moss made her pause. But she wouldn't be stopped. She was determined to find the mechanism he'd set up for his trick before he could hide it from her again. But there was no mirror, no glass, and if she was honest with herself, she'd heard no thump when the rock had suddenly stopped in mid-air and changed direction. Maybe a magnet. She hurried to the water's edge and tried to find the little rock he had supposedly pulled from the forest floor, but there were hundreds there that looked just like it.
Fine,
She said in a huff.
come over here. You're gonna have to prove to me you can't cross this barrier.
He let his head fall back and closed his eyes. What ye propose, lass, is much less good for the soul. Wouldn't ye rather come back and be at peace for a wee while? Of course he'd say that.
No, I'll be at peace when I know how you did your trick.
He climbed to his feet, tucking his kilt around his knees as he did so, then crossed the creek by stepping on one stone in the centre. There wasn't much room for them between the slope and the magic barrier, so she had to stand close.
Keep walking, buddy.
She ordered, and gave him a little nudge. He moved his foot forward, but never put his weight on it. I canna. She rolled her eyes, then tapped his arm.
Hang on. I'm gonna give you a shove, and I want you to stand on one foot so you can't brace yourself, okay?
He closed his eyes again, like he was praying for patience. I'll do it, the once. I'll not have you harming yourself trying to prove me a liar, eh?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
She had him stand 2 feet back from the invisible line, then stood behind him and waited for him to lift one boot off the ground. He wasn't leaning back against her either, so it should be an easy thing to do. Push him off balance and force him to stumble forward. So she pushed, hard. He fell forward and put his hands out to catch himself. She stepped to the side and found that he wasn't bracing himself against the trees. He was bracing himself against the air. Chapter 10. Alexander knew the moment Miss Chelsea understood that there was something otherworldly going on. It was almost as if he heard the pop of a bubble warning him.
You.
The lass pointed an accusing finger at him and stepped backward into the brush.
You.
She said again. Her attention turned to the side as she checked her footing and took yet another step away, but the finger still pointed.
You.
She tumbled sideways before he could get his feet under him and reach her, and for the third time since they'd met, he failed to catch her hand in time to prevent her from toppling into the burn. The pitch of her surprise mirrored the chill of the Highland water. But when she spoke again, it was the same.
You.
Aye, he said, nodding to placate her, while he bent and scooped her person away from the tide rising against her gown. Her unexpected weight was due to a few gallons of water clinging to her skirts, but he didn't complain as he carried her up the rise and continued to answer every "you" with an "I." "Stand on your feet," he ordered, as he put those feet to the tiles in the shower. She obeyed, and though her teeth chattered, he reckoned it was more from shock than from the icy cold of the mountain runoff. "Turn," he said firmly. She obeyed again. He pushed her tumbling hair to the side and tugged on the zipper.
You.
"Aye." He pushed the heavy cloth away from her sides and forced it into a puddle at her feet, while he tried to ignore the flesh of her derriere pressed against the wet and delicate shift she wore beneath it. "Step out," he said more gruffly than he wished. She lifted one shoe and held it until he pushed it where it needed to go. The second shoe did the same, and he slid the mass of white free. While keeping a hand to the lass's lower back, in case her knees failed, he whipped the gown up over the edge of the glass cage and allowed it to hang there. Then he guided her to a wide ledge of tiles and told her to sit. She crossed her arms in front of her and hid her gaze behind damp clumps of hair. He turned on the shower, adjusted the temperature of the water, then aimed the showerhead her way. "Warm yourself," he said gently. "I will find something possible for clothing. Call out if you need me. Can you do that?" She started to shake her head, but then recovered and nodded firmly. He left her to her own devices and tried to keep his mind from lingering on the body he needed to clothe, and simply focus his attention on locating the garb to do it with. In the kitchen, he found an apron, 5 dish towels, and 3 wash towels. In the living room, the pelt of a deer on the wall, a small thick rug what would hardly roll, let alone conform to her form, and a loosely woven blanket that would show more than it covered. Back in the bedchamber again, the closet was bare. The small pile of towels wouldn't do. The drawers were empty, but for small vials of shampoo and small cards of soap. He had only one alternative. A minute later, after a quick pop into the kitchen for a bit of rope, he knocked on the door to the bathroom.
Did you find clothes?
She called. "I'll leave you a dress and a belt on the bed, lass. Do you need help?"
No.
She said firmly, giving him cause to hope she was recovering from the shock, at least for the moment.
Thank you.
She added. He ate a bit while he tidied up the kitchen. The wine was better left alone, he reckoned, and drank water from the pipes instead. When the bedchamber door opened, he jumped like a guilty child, then stepped into the living room to see what she made of his improvisation. She stood shyly by the door for a moment, then stepped into the room and turned in a circle.
Not bad. Thank you.
The belted poncho he'd made from one of the bedsheets suited her better than the wedding gown had done. At least she could move about in it without causing a ruckus. He'd sliced a small hole for her head. Then, about a foot or so away from that hole to either side, he'd cut an even smaller hole for her arms. Through those holes her hands and forearms protruded, and she was free to move them about without revealing any more of her. She'd bunched it up, however, and left a disturbing expanse of her calves showing beneath. Of course, he'd seen women in shorts all through the summer months, but not while he was burdened with the weaknesses of the flesh. He would simply have to keep his gaze away from the floor, was all. She gave him a wide grin. Her approval was a relief. The only other option he had to give her was the kilt off his back, and she wouldn't appreciate him walking about the place in nothing but his long shirt. At least, he didn't believe she would. Their smiles faded in unison, and they stared at each other. A shiver started at her elbows and shook her shoulders. He looked to the hearth and grimaced. "Forgive me, lass. I should have lit the fire afore now." He pulled a wooden rocker close, insisted she sit, and bent to light the fire. He desired to light a match for half a century, and was happy to find a box of them on the mantel, but it was almost a disappointment how little effort was needed to get a good cook on the wood. His efforts, however, would be better spent in conversation with a lovely lass who might well be the last one he would ever see in the flesh. She declined a glass of wine or water, so he finally settled into a large, comfortable chair facing the fire. "Are you feeling sound, then?" he asked politely, dreading the conversation to come, hoping she'd forgotten all about the silly rock and the barrier. Perhaps her mind would find a way to hide the memory from her, as had happened in one telly program or another.
I turned on my phone long enough to send Austin a text.
She stared at her fingers.
I told him I'm safe, not to worry about me, and that I'm not ready to talk about it.
After a minute, she looked up.
But I am ready to talk about that rock. But first, I want to know if I'll be able to leave here. If I got up and walked out of here, how far would I get? Am I trapped here too?
He quickly shook his head. "The barrier is for me alone. You're free to leave whenever you wish." She leaned forward until her bare feet were flat on the floor and her elbows rested on her knees. Thankfully, the sheet draped low over her calves.
All right, tell me, why can't you leave? And what kind of magic?
She waved toward the kitchen, but he knew she meant the glen beyond it. "If you think you can stand to keep your eyes open for a long-winded story." She nodded. "Then I'll start at the beginning." Her toes poked at the floor and got the chair to move. He supposed the motion had a soothing effect on her, much like Rabby petting old Dolphin, for which he was glad. She would need soothing by the time he was done. He pretended not to notice the way her fingers bit into her own arms when he told her he was born in 1718 and died on Culloden Moor in 1746. She sat back quickly when he explained how he'd risen on Culloden the day after the battle, a ghost. She never interrupted, though, even when he skimmed over the happenings of the past 200 and nearly 70 years since that day. She leaned close again when he told about Sansaray, how she had been a witch all along, but they'd never known it, and why he'd been sent to this grand cottage to await the moment when an impressive, heroic action would be needed. He omitted the detail of how much time he might have to accomplish this deed, and if he fails, that he'll miss the chance to help wee Rabby summon the courage to escape the moor. All he'd said about it was that he'd already given away his boon in exchange for the chance to help the lad. She sniffed and wiped her eyes with the edge of the sheet.
Well, that's just stupid. Waiving your right to your boon, or whatever you call it, should be heroic enough, don't you think? The witch should have called it good and let you be done.
He shrugged. "I've never been gifted with knowing a woman's mind, lass. I'm not Jamie bloody Fraser, am I?"
Sorry?
He shook his head, disgusted with himself again. He'd let his bitter past sink into his mind, much as the weather creeping up on them. The natural light dimmed, and the smell of rain seeped through the screen and around the edge of the inner door. When the rain did come, he would go outside and stretch his arms wide, look up at the sky and feel the drops splash against his skin. For too long he'd been immune and unfeeling to Scottish weather. The chance to touch the Highland rain again was a boon in itself. "Never ye mind," he told the lass. "Just a popular character from fiction. I thought you might be familiar."
Popular, huh?
"Aye."
It knows how to understand women.
He smiled at the tease. "Look, aye, and a braw Scottish laddie to boot."
Mm-hmm.
"Of course, he was created by a woman, so—" She nodded.
Oh, I see. About as popular and probable as unicorns.
"Exactly that. And if the television actor farted rainbows, I wouldn't be surprised." After she stopped giggling, he then confessed to trying to use his own name of Fraser to lure her back to the house when he worried she might leave him in truth. She sat forward again, as did he, feeling a need to be closer to the lass, but not bold enough to move his chair for fear of frightening her again. Her charming toes pinched at the floor, and he wondered if they were cold.
So you think you're supposed to save me from something? You think I'm your damsel in distress?
The sparkle in her eyes made him believe the idea intrigued her. Many, alas, might have been offended by the idea of needing any man's help. Perhaps, he said.
It couldn't be from Austin, but maybe from Rick? Or maybe from a bear?
It has been centuries since we've had bears in Scotland, lass. She sucked in her bottom lip and studied his face for a moment. He could hardly wait to discover what was going on behind those clever eyes.
Maybe.
She finally said.
You're supposed to save me from you.
He came very near to closing the distance between them, taking her in his arms and showing her how a mortal man might truly pose a danger to her. But from the look on her face, she had understood the message in any case. Chapter 11. At long last, Alexander could appreciate the term awkward silence. Seconds ticked by while they gazed at each other, waiting for the other one to disrupt the quiet. A slow smile stretched across Chelsea's blushing face, and she chuckled. He laughed along with her to try to dispel the discomfort of the moment.
Well, since I don't have anything else on my calendar, I think I can stick around for a while and see what happens.
He inclined his head. I'd be much obliged to ye.
Maybe you can tell me more about your ghost friends.
A pleasant change to be sure, speaking of things other than themselves. It was evident she wished to avoid the subject of her own wedding, just as he wished to avoid the memory of the day when he too came close to marrying, or at least he thought he had. She rocked the chair on and off, stopping when the conversation grew serious, rocking while he told her of silly things like the colour of heather, gorse, and the enchanting glen behind the cottage, all more beautiful now that he could see them with mortal eyes, and how he would like to see Culloden one last time in full light. When there was little else to tell, her legs seemed to grow weary, and the chair settled. A sigh escaped her, heavy with regret. She tried to smile, but failed.
I can't really believe any of this, you know?
Oh, aye. He knew her acceptance of his tale had been too good to be true. I can only guess at how impossible it all sounds. It would have seemed outlandish to me had I not been witness to my own death, felt the blood drain from my body, and leave me cold as the moor itself. A shiver passed through him at the memory. She wrapped her arms around herself as well.
And supposedly, when you go again, you'll die again?
The idea was sobering and brought him to his feet. He bent to stoke the fire to excuse the action. I dinna ken what will happen, lass. I can only hope that Sanseret, a lass I've known nearly all her life, would not put me through something as violent as my first death. A second death? Please, spare me that. It suddenly occurred to him that such a fate was likely what made Rabby hesitate. Before he assured the laddie it was safe to move on, he would have it from Sonny's own lips that there would be nothing frightening awaiting Rabby if he did as he was bid. Laughter filled the room, and he turned to find Chelsea with her head thrown back against her chair, and her hands gripping the carved arms as she laughed herself silly. His own thoughts were far too sober to laugh with her, though he could not help but smile at her delight. He scooted his arse onto the hearth and waited for her to finish. It proved to be a fine manoeuvre to get closer to the lass, so he was in no hurry to have his curiosity satisfied. When she finally wound down, like a child's toy running out of battery power, there were tears in her eyes that couldn't all be blamed on amusement. His smile fled, and he reached out and took her hand in his. "What is it, lass?" She bit at her lip, and her brows worried together.
Are you even here? Maybe Am I going crazy?
He was finally able to chuckle, though lightly. "Nay, lass, you're not mad at all. Any sane woman would balk at what I've said, at what you saw in the glen. Nothing natural about it, to be sure." He squeezed her hand. "Do you feel that?" She nodded, relieved. "I'm real enough, then, for the moment." She seemed much calmer, though still a bit worried.
Then what do we do?
"We? Look, but the dilemma is nae yours, lass. I alone must prepare for what may need doing. Nothing for you to worry over at all." She was the one to squeeze his hand then, and he felt it all the way to his heart.
But you'll go away as soon as this quest is over?
"Aye, lass, straight away, I would hope. For every minute I can spare the laddie from his tenure on the moor is a victory, is it not?" She nodded. Could he dare imagine she might regret never seeing him again? "Let us not worry o'er it," he said cheerfully. "Tell me about yourself, while there is still time to tell it. Later I will wish I knew more about ye, and the curve of your cheek and the bow of your lips." Her hand flew up to cover her mouth, and she blushed.
You'll remember my lips?
"Och, aye, I've stared at them long enough, haven't I?" She giggled and forced her hand to the side, then bit her lip to keep from smiling. It was the dearest sight, and a moving one. In fact, it moved him off the hearth to kneel before her knees. She sobered instantly, and though she appeared uneasy to have him so close, he couldn't drag himself away. At least for a moment. He wanted to be near enough to feel the warmth of her, to see her face clearly, to absorb the sound of her voice into his bones. It would all make a fine memory, no matter where he went after. "Well, that's a pretty sight, isn't it?" Rick stood on the small porch holding the screen open. He'd already pushed the inner door wide, but Alexander hadn't heard so much as a squeak. And, sitting before the fire, he'd not felt the air move. He was already on his feet, ready to defend the woman with his life, as he'd been prepared to do all day. It seemed a quiet moment alone with her. A kind word and a gentle touch were to be fleeting things, but he was glad the gifts had come before it all ended. It took all his concentration to keep from glancing at the weapon mounted just above the doorway. If the man charged, there would be no time to reach it. He needed to keep the man outside. He hurried forward, blocking the villain's view of the lass, demanding his attention. He only hoped his expression promised pain if the man had ill intentions.
Wait!
Chelsea's voice stopped him in his tracks. He turned sideways to divide his attention between her and the one who so upset her. She stood and crossed her arms over her chest. The defensive move was telling. This man had hurt her before.
Is Austin with you?
Rick sneered. "No, he's sleeping, hopefully." She stuck her chin out like the brave lass he knew her to be.
Then what do you want?
"I want your promise that you'll leave him alone. But now that I've got these pictures," he waved his camera back and forth, "I don't need any promises from you. I'll let these do the talking, and there will be nothing you can say that will make him want to listen." He laughed and walked sideways down the steps. "You have a nice weekend, cheese." He strode arrogantly down the drive, then began jogging at the bottom. No buggy in sight. Alexander prayed for the clouds to unleash their load and humble the blackguard. The lass stood rooted to the spot, staring at the open doorway. Alexander had no idea what might soothe her, so he waited for her to give him some hint. A long minute later, they heard a distant engine turn over. With the door mostly closed as it had been, it was no wonder they hadn't heard the man approach. Finally, Chelsea met his gaze.
That should put the nail in the coffin, right?
He winced at her choice of words.
Oh my gosh.
She hurried to him and gently squeezed the sides of his arms.
I'm so sorry. That was a horrible thing to say. Please forgive me.
There was the gentle touch again, a kind word, another private moment. So he wasted no time. Tell me, lass, do you still feel the same as you did in the glen?
You mean petrified?
Nay, like you didn't belong to any man. Her hands fell away as she released a drawn-out breath.
Yes, I do.
He nodded sharply. Good. With gentle hands he tugged on her arms, then gathered her close. For I believe the balm that will solve both our woes is a kiss. Surprise parted her lips, and he took advantage. At least, if she wasn't prepared, she couldn't send him arse over tea kettle into the fire. Her lips were sweet and soft as he knew they'd be, and the tang of her skin nearly intoxicated him after so many years without any sense of taste. His memories of most things had faded and jumbled, and he imagined if he sipped whiskey again, it would pale in comparison to this lass's kiss, as would roses, violets, honey on his tongue. Chelsea seemed taken with the kiss as well. For a long while she played give and take with him, but when the toying ended, he should have stepped back. He held her close just a moment too long, and her thoughts must have found their way through the lovely haze he tried to create around them, for her tears tumbled down her face and onto his chin. She tried to retreat, but he pulled her against him, cradled her head gently to the side, and straightened so she could grate against his chest and catch her tears on his shirt. She ceased resisting, and waves of sobbing broke over whatever barriers she'd erected for herself. Listening closely with all his soul, he heard it, that moment when her heart well and truly broke. If the groom and his henchmen were lined up at the door just then, he would have run them both through in a single thrust of his spear. Chapter 12.
Dear diary, if I ever fall apart again, really fall apart, I'm gonna find a Highlander first. If I'm gonna bawl my eyes out, what I really need is for the skies to unload millions of gallons of water and for the rumble of thunder to match the exact tone and vibration to the guy petting my head and saying soothing things in a language that could not possibly be real.
Chelsea smiled into her tissue. Yeah, that's what she'd write, if she was the type to keep a journal. Oh, and she would have to remember to add in the part about having a nice, soft sash of plaid wool to discreetly wipe her nose on in an emergency situation. Only she kind of got busted on that one. He had to have suspected what she'd done because a few seconds later he'd excused himself, went to the kitchen, and came back with a box of tissues. He didn't look too disgusted though, so maybe he hadn't noticed at all, or maybe he was just a good actor. Better now? He asked softly. She nodded and moved to the small fire to toss the tissue into the flames. I do regret the pictures the man was able to take. I should have never moved so close to you, aye. She shook her head.
Don't worry about it. Rick's a patient man. He would have waited as long as he had to for what he needed. If he meant to ask me to leave Austin alone, he would have parked at the bottom of the hill, but he didn't. He knows that being sneaky always pays off eventually.
Just the same, he said. I am happy to stand as witness if ye'd care to call Austin to come to the property to hear our side of things.
No. If I can't forgive myself for what I've done, I won't ask him to forgive me.
Is that it then? The reason you greet so? Because you cannot forgive yourself?
I guess, no.
She shrugged.
I don't know.
She had no energy left for thinking. He nodded knowingly. You've had a long day of it. You need to close your eyes and rest a bit. He took her by the shoulder and turned her toward the bedroom. Go ye now, and lie abed. Nothing will change but the weather while you sleep, and I'll give you privacy, I vow it.
You vow it?
She giggled, then remembered the conversation they'd been having before Rick interrupted. He wasn't even real. She spun around to face him.
Wait,
He closed his eyes, shook his head, and turned her back around before pushing her through the door. No waiting, no thinking, just sleeping. I promise to be here when ye wake.
but
I said no thinking. We'll talk later.
talk?
Look, aye, and we'll maybe kiss a bit. He didn't allow her to turn. But if you think much about it, neither of us will sleep, will we?
What time is it?
She allowed him to steer her to the side of the bed. With the storm outside, she couldn't even make a guess. Time had gone by at a dozen different speeds since the moment she woke up at Castle Murray while it was still dark outside. Time to sleep. Her protector pulled back the blankets and covered her up after she tucked her feet in. Then he bent to kiss her. But instead of her lips, he swooped up at the last second and kissed her chastely on the forehead, then chuckled as he left. She threw a pillow at him too late, and it hit the door as it closed. He peeked back in. Sleep, lass. Through till tomorrow, if needs be. Then he was gone. Chelsea was wrong. It was possible to tell exactly what time it was when she woke up. No need for clocks or to see the position of the sun or stars. It was absolutely straight down the middle, the dead of night. She couldn't see her hand in front of her face, and she panicked the way people did when they think there might be the slightest possibility they've gone blind. She felt a good old-fashioned freak-out coming on for a wholly unique reason. Instantly alert, grogginess was not her problem. She knew where she was, so there was nothing wrong with her memory, or no after-effects of the wine she'd had, whether or not it had been drugged. And she wasn't afraid due to the possibility that a real ghost might be in the next room, the ghost of a Scottish soldier from Culloden Moor, one of the most haunted places on the planet. No, she was on the verge of freaking out due to the chance that said ghost might be gone.
Mr. Fraser.
She said. Her voice sounded funny in the dark, so she cleared her throat and tried again.
Alexander.
The door flew open before the echo of her voice died against the bathroom tiles, so he must have heard the first thing she'd said. The light from the next room was enough to prove she wasn't blind, and the man, breathing heavily, with one hand on the wall and the other holding the door open, proved he hadn't left her. With her biggest fear put to rest, she couldn't think of what to say. He continued to stare at her while his breathing calmed. Aye, lass, what is it I can do for ye?
I woke up and it was really dark and I was afraid you had gone.
He walked quietly toward her. Her heart jumped and started pounding so loud she thought he might be able to hear it too, but he faced the bureau and pulled out the top drawer. After rummaging around for a few seconds, he closed the drawer and left the room, but didn't shut the door. So she sat there and wondered what in the heck was going on. He appeared a minute later with a lit candle in his hand, and it was then she realized he was missing his kilt. His shirt was plenty long, however, like an old-fashioned nightshirt that went halfway down his thighs.
If you had a long pointy cap hanging off to one side of your head, you'd be a younger version of Ebenezer Scrooge, waiting for the 3 Christmas ghosts to visit.
I am familiar with Dickens and the plays on the television. He didn't sound too pleased about it. In fact, he sounded a little gruff.
I'm so sorry I woke you. I should have gotten up and turned on the light. I just kind of panicked.
Lass, he said, bending to set the candle into a candle holder on the nightstand. "You didna wake me. I'll not sleep away the 2 days I've been given, and I'm happy to be of some service to ye." Her head shook quickly, all on its own.
You never said anything about 2 days. You only have 2 days?
He tipped his head back and grimaced. "I didna mean to worry ye. Besides, I've an entire day left now. I'm certain I'll manage something before my time is at hand." She scooted her legs to the side and patted the bed by her knees. He hesitated, then sat. He put a hand on the bed on the far side of her legs and leaned over her lower half.
And what happens if you don't do something heroic before your time is up?
He tilted his head, but said nothing. Was the answer obvious? If he did succeed, he was going to go get the boy off the battlefield, then move on to the next life.
If you fail, you won't be able to help the boy, or you won't be able to move on? Will you be trapped at Culloden Moor forever?
He frowned and used his free hand to pick at the white tie in the centre of a dark quilt square. "I reckon I won't be able to see Rabby again, to ease his mind. I ken Sonny will take great care of the lad, but he trusts me."
Who wouldn't?
She said it quietly, but his head snapped up. She'd just confessed that she trusted him too, she supposed, but he really shouldn't have been surprised. After all, she'd called out for him in the middle of the night. "Truth be told," he said, and dropped his attention back to the quilt. "There was a lass, nearly 3 centuries ago, who couldn't put her trust in me even though we were to be married." Holy cow! She'd never asked him if he was married before. Of course, if any of this twisted fairy tale were true, his wife and family would have died a long time ago, but the idea of kissing a married man made her feel horrible.
But you didn't marry?
He shook his head half-heartedly. "Her sister waylaid me in the barn, kissed me. I thought it was May Meredith, but it was Fiona. And the mean lass must have told her sister I'd intended it. Of course I had no ken what went on between them, but the next day I was given a note by Mary's own hand to meet her at the kirk wall at 6 o'clock that evening, that she could no longer wait to be married. The kirk wall was the place we often sat and spoke of how our lives would be after we were man and wife. It was natural she would wish to meet there. In any case, I bathed and put on my finery, prepared my cottage for the woman of the house, and got myself to the kirk wall." He swallowed and stopped talking. She didn't want to ask the question, but how could she not? Now it was clear by the reaction he'd had when he found out she was a runaway bride that he'd been left at the altar himself.
What had he said? That all men are too trusting until they've been betrayed?
She didn't want to hear the rest, but she deserved it, so she asked.
What happened?
He nodded, looked her in the eye, then leaned away just a little. The message was clear. He was back to disliking her again. "I waited what seemed an hour," he finally said, "but it couldn't have been half that. And suddenly the church bell rang, and the door swung open, and there was my Meredith clutching the arm of Paddy Ewan, who smiled like the cat who'd spilled the cream. Mary craned her neck to see me, waiting where I'd been told, and the look in her eye was unmistakable. Pure hatred it was. I was stunned, of course, unable to move while the wedding party paraded past me. Her family avoided looking my way, but Mary stopped. While her new husband looked on, gloating, she tossed a small bouquet of flowers into my hands. Then she stuck her nose in the air and walked on. At the back of the pack was Fiona. She blew me a kiss and a wink, and to this day I canna say whether she expected to have me for herself or just didn't want her sister to be happy.
Alexander, that's horrible.
Chelsea leaned forward and gave his arm a squeeze. Before she remembered, he wouldn't welcome it. She pulled her hand back quickly and folded her arms.
Neither of them deserved you. You're such a great guy. Meredith was out of her mind not to trust you.
Finally he smiled, but it was a very sad smile. "And you're Austin. You've nary an unkind word to say about him, lass, and I've been listening for it, with all my heart." He dragged himself to his feet and walked slowly to the door. With a hand on the knob, he faced her with a wide, fake, have-to-be-nice-to-the-tourist smile. "In only an hour or more, dawn arrives. I'll fix you a grand Scottish breakfast, and we'll hammer out a plan for getting you back to your husband-to-be." Chelsea stared at the closed door for at least a minute before she lay back down. As she watched the candlelight dance on the ceiling, she had just one thought.
Meredith, honey, you are an idiot.
And from somewhere deep in her brain came a response.
Chelsea, honey, so are you.
Chapter 13. She woke to the sound of singing. The voice belonged to her host. The deep rumble of a baritone poured out from under the bathroom door, accompanied by the spray of the shower. It didn't matter what the tune was supposed to be. There was no question it was off, and the words were sung in that impossible Gallic language that she couldn't believe anyone could understand, unless they lived hundreds of years ago. Yesterday she thought it was a fairy tale meant to distract her from her heartbreak, but by the time she went to bed, she was pretty sure it was true. In the bright, glaring light of morning, she didn't know what to think. The guy didn't act crazy. Okay, so his clothes were eccentric. His speech patterns, including his vows and words like mayhap, could just be a Scottish thing. That wasn't unusual at all. Heck, for all she knew, he was just an Outlander fan gone rogue. Of course, she wasn't about to let him know that she was familiar with the books and the cable show. She'd pretended not to know what he was talking about once, so she had to stick with her story. But damn, he could have walked off the set and decided to spend his vacation in character to see if he could get some American chick to go all gaga for him. Well, she nearly had. When he'd come into her dark room and headed for her, in that split second before he turned to the bureau to find a candle, she couldn't admit what she'd been hoping for. Of course, she wouldn't have slept with the guy, even if he'd been the star of the show, but she wouldn't have minded some lip action worthy of the big screen. She shook her head and tried to dispel the shadows and images of the night before, the way he'd stared at her, all out of breath, when he'd first burst through the door. The backs of his legs, below his long shirt when he'd walked away. The way her breath had caught when he leaned down to kiss her goodnight, then planted his lips on her head, and that sexy little smile as he turned his head, knowing what he'd done to her. Yeah, she'd come up with a perfectly logical reason for his odd actions, and if he had walked off the set of some Scottish film, Macbeth maybe, that would explain why he was so convincing when telling his sad story. "I'm a ghost from Culloden who was jilted at the altar." But that wouldn't explain what she'd seen. A guy leaning forward at maybe a 30-degree angle, supporting himself on nothing. It wouldn't explain the rocks, and it wouldn't explain why she felt deep in her gut that there was a clock ticking somewhere that would determine whether or not the spirit of a little boy would be able to finally leave a gruesome battlefield. Even if it was all bull, even if someone came to the door and said, "Ha ha, the joke's on you," she was pretty sure that clock thing wouldn't go away. She would probably never be able to explain it. Of course, she still had her own problems to deal with. It was mean of her to keep avoiding Austin, but their problems didn't have a time limit attached to them. If Austin really wanted to marry her, to stay married to her for the rest of their lives, like he'd promised, then they'd be able to work things out once Rick was exposed for the snake he was. But the fate of Alexander and the little boy would be determined in a day. If she was able to help, she was going to help. Of course, other people would see that as an excuse, but she didn't care. Until time ran out, she would just have to trust that Austin would understand, eventually. And at the moment, trust seemed to be the magic word of the day. The singing stopped, and her heart started pumping overtime. What would she see when he opened that bathroom door? A coward to the end, she scooted back under the blanket, pulled it up to her chin, and turned her head away. The doorknob clicked and she froze. "Good morrow, Chelsea," he said, and chills shot through her from her feet, which were closest to him, to her ears. She glanced at the mirror and realized his reflection was looking her in the face. Wrapped only in a towel, he carried a pile of clothes in his arms. "May I have use of the bed, lass, to don my plaid?" She sat up and sprang to her feet, averted her eyes, and hurried through the bathroom door behind him. She had to pee anyway. When she turned the lock, she could feel the vibrations through the wood. He was laughing at her, and what his laughter did to her insides turned all her newfound trust into a bowl of warm, melting jello that couldn't even be trusted to stay on the spoon. Chapter 14. Alexander used all the knowledge he'd gleaned from the telly to cook Austin's bride a proper Scottish breakfast. There were no mushrooms left, and he'd been unable to find any edible ones outside to replace those he'd used for mushrooms with parsley mud the night before. He only hoped she would be thirsty, for he had plenty of juice, milk, and tea.
You sure don't cook like an 18th century man,
she said when she came to the table.
I kind of expected you to be roasting it all on a stick over a fire in the backyard.
She was wearing the sheet again, but her shift poked out the bottom. Another layer between them, for which he was grateful.
I know the clothes aren't all clean, but the body is,
she added cheerfully. But she must have read his discomfort on his face, for she cleared her throat and tried again.
I mean, I had a shower and washed my hair, so, I won't stink or anything.
She ultimately dissolved into a blushing mass of damp curls and hid her face behind her hands. He couldn't seem to stop his hand from reaching for one of those curls and tucking it behind her ear, revealing part of that lovely face and inviting her to come out from behind her hand. "We'll neither of us stink, then." They shared a laugh while he put the plate of back bacon on the table. When he folded his hands together for grace, she followed suit, then peeked at him the entire time he recited the prayer. They ate in companionable silence while he waited for her questions. He was so certain she would have some, but he was wrong. When their plates were clean, he wondered if she had forgotten all that had transpired the day before.
I've been thinking.
She stood and began clearing the table.
What if I climb up on top of the roof and, fall off or something? You can catch me, save me from breaking my neck. Do you think that would work?
Well, she'd at least remembered his quest, but what did she think about returning to Austin? He dared not ask until his breakfast had settled in his stomach. "Sonny's a canny lass," he said. "She'd recognise a set-up in a trice. I'm fair certain of it. Besides, she likely has a plan, and must simply wait to see what that plan entails." Chelsea nodded and bent to the task of washing the dishes.
I'm good with waiting.
A short while later, they strolled down to the glen to see about catching a fish for lunch. He used the fishing tackle he'd found in the house, added a worm to the hook, and dropped a line in the water just above a shadowy spot that ran deep and smooth.
I was thinking.
The lass perched on the flat top of a large mossy stone.
This Meredith chick sounds pretty mean. It's one thing to marry another guy, either because she liked him better or she was mad at you.
She toyed with the edge of the water with her bare toe.
But to invite you to watch? That was so mean. I think you dodged a bullet.
Her gaze flew to his, and she grimaced, no doubt sensing she'd said something insensitive, to a man who had probably died from a bullet he hadn't dodged. But he waved away her concern. His own death didn't bother him much after all that time, not nearly as much as the wound to his heart had, at least. Women are mean creatures by nature, of course. He grinned when she gave him an indignant gasp. Men are much more forthright. She rolled her lovely eyes.
And this is coming from a soldier. Men kill each other all the time. How can you say women are meaner than that?
To avoid scaring away their lunch, he moved closer to the lass and lowered his voice. To kill a man in battle is not so mean at all, to my way of thinking. There is something honest and simple about it. One man says, I will fight to the death for what I believe. The other says, I will fight to the death to prove you wrong. And they fight. A promise given, a promise kept. One man survives and has proven his point. The other man proves himself with his own spilt blood. There is nothing mean about it. The mean part is what happens to the women who loved the ones who don't come back. He gave her a wink. Perhaps this is what turns them mean. She laughed, and the clouds seemed to part. And if more light did not make it through the treetops to shine on their little idol, it made no matter. He'd drawn the laugh from her, a victory he would cherish.
Well, if I'd been Meredith.
She found a stick and began drawing in the mud at the burn's edge.
Losing you to someone else would have made me mean, I guess.
Look, aye, the lass was mean, no question. She took something very precious from me.
Your heart?
Nay, my right to love her. Nothing is quite so mean as to be forbidden to love. He grimaced, embarrassed by the lass's rapt attention. He had no choice but to go on. Meredith stopped me from loving her. She smiled and walked away, as if my love was as meaningless as the rain. The right, nay, the ability to love someone is the freedom granted to all, but she deprived me that freedom. There are some things you cannot take from a man if he will not give them, but there are also things you cannot give a woman if she will not have them. In the beginning, yes, Meredith did take my love, but what she did with it without trusting me, without giving me a chance to challenge whatever her sister might have said, was mean indeed. He bent and plucked up a wide, pink flower. She took my love and let it fall from her fingers to shatter like the petals of a crushed rose as she walked away, and they fluttered in her wake and fell dead and lifeless on the ground. He did the same with the pink blossoms. So when they turn their backs on ye, if they know they hurt you, and they take joy in the hurting, your love dies quickly like a fish denied the ocean. A few surprised gasps, unaccepting, and it's over. A sharp clap drew their attention to the top of the ravine. Then another followed, and he realized it was the sound of car doors closing. Chelsea peeled and started to stand, but he waved her back down. Stay where you are. Let me see who it is. She was already shaking, and he realized she truly was not prepared to come face to face with St. Austin as yet. The fishing pole was forgotten, and he hurried up the path and around the house. He saw the front of the car first. Someone had pulled all the way up the drive to park at the top. It wasn't the blue vehicle of the proprietor, but a new red SUV. Since he'd heard the slam of two doors, he prepared himself to face both Austin and the dastardly one, possibly more. But there was no one about, no one waiting on the steps. The door, however, stood wide when he remembered closing it behind them when he and Chelsea had come outside. He hurried up the steps as quietly as he could, but it was imperative that he get his hand on the lance before he was noticed. The screen door opened silently. His weight caused no squeak off the floor. He turned and reached above his head, but the weapon was gone. Chapter 15. Chelsea heard the surprised, high pitch of a woman and jumped to her feet. Suddenly, all her nervousness about facing Austin was gone. If he'd brought Emily along for a front row seat to their confrontation, Chelsea was going to toss her out on her ear. And if that wasn't ladylike enough for Austen, she knew a big, handsome Scot who would probably appreciate her combat talents. At least he would for another day. It didn't matter. Alexander was there now, and with him at her back. There was no need to sit and quake in the shrubs and wait for the visitors to leave again. She could handle just about anything. The red car was a surprise, only because it was parked so close to the house. Voices, including Alexander's, came from inside.
"It looks like a giant's pencil,"
said a woman from the kitchen, so Chelsea headed in there. Her hands were on her hips before she rounded the corner. "Aye, a pencil. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like my pencil back." Alexander stood with one hand outstretched. A woman, around 50 years old, sat on top of the table with her legs crossed, smoking a cigarette and talking out the other side of her mouth.
"Why do you need a giant pencil?"
Alexander let out a pent-up breath. "It's nae a pencil, you daft woman. It's a spear." The woman snorted smoke out of her nose, then choked. Another woman, who looked just like the first one, came around the corner from the dining room.
"You're not supposed to be smoking in here, Lorraine. Wickham will have to pay a fine if you do." "Who's Wickham?"
Chelsea demanded. She was upset because Alexander was upset, but she also thought it would be a good idea to keep up a bold front in case these two thought the rental house was theirs for the day. With only a day left before that internal clock ran out, she wasn't going to let two strangers push them around.
"You must be Chelsea,"
said the one on the table, her cigarette wagging. Her sister reached up and plucked the thing out of her lips, walked it over to the garbage can, lifted the lid and chucked it in.
"Who's Wickham?"
she asked again, ignoring the fact that they knew her name. Alexander could have told them.
"Our brother,"
answered the one, while she washed her fingers in the sink. Her sister on the table was still giving her the stink eye.
"He rented this place for Alexander here. Sonsaray is our niece. He's told you about her, hasn't he? I only have one cigarette a year, and since you didn't let me finish it, that one doesn't count."
Loretta rolled her eyes and waved a hand.
"Ignore her."
"Aye, I told her about Sonsaray. Now, may I have my pencil? I mean to say, my spear." The one called Lorraine shrugged and tossed it to him, which was surprising, considering how heavy the branch was.
"I'm very sorry we're late,"
said the sister.
"Late?"
Chelsea said it in unison with Alexander.
"Yes, we were supposed to be here yesterday, but we got lost."
"Yesterday?" he frowned. "Why?" Loretta laughed.
"Chaperones, of course."
Alexander smiled and nodded, but his lips were slightly pinched as he came toward her, took hold of her forearm and led her back outside. They strolled around to the back of the SUV, where he spun around to face her. "I have no ken what they're about. I ken only that a man named Muir paid for my lodging here. They said it is the same Wickham, and the name Sonsaray is not a common one, aye, so they must ken the witch."
"Did you tell them my name?"
He leaned close and whispered. "I did not." He shook his head in frustration. "You're certain they were not members of your wedding party? Perhaps it is a cruel jest orchestrated by that Rick fella."
"No, they're not Austen's family, and Rick certainly wouldn't have known about Sonsaray. But it is kind of funny that Sonsaray sent chaperones, right?"
One of his brows lifted. "Aye, you think so? And where do you suppose everyone will sleep this night? And how much privacy will we find to discuss how to get you back together with Austen?" She was pretty sure that whatever privacy he had worried about didn't involve Austen at all, but he was too embarrassed to admit it. He was obviously still caught up on that kissing another man's woman idea, which only made him sweeter. But she was still in denial about belonging to anyone, no matter how their conversation had ended the night before. And if the man decided to kiss her, She was pretty sure she wasn't going to stop him, but those women might.
I see what you mean.
Her gaze caught on his bottom lip and couldn't seem to move on to his eyes. His tongue came out and swept moisture across it. Do you know? She lifted her chin without thinking, and his mouth quickly found hers. The kiss was as frantic as she felt, crushing and desperate, like they were saying goodbye.
Hoo-hoo!
The woman's voice came from the porch.
Alexander!
He closed his eyes for a few seconds, then hollered, "Aye."
Are you going to bring that fish in for lunch, dear, or do you plan to leave it thrashing on the line?
Chelsea frowned up at him.
How could you know there's a fish on the line?
He shuddered and shook his head. "I'm afeard to ask." After squeezing her hands briefly, he walked around her and headed back to the fairy glen. She quickly followed.
Chelsea, dear.
The woman smiled innocently, leaning back against the open screen.
If you'd like to come back inside, we've got some clothes for you.
She nodded and gave up on following Alexander, but as much as she wanted to get dressed in real clothes again, she couldn't help suspecting that the sisters planned to take their chaperoning duties very seriously. Chapter 16. Alexander would have preferred to eat his meal out of doors, but the sisters wouldn't hear of it. They'd gone to a lot of fuss, they'd said, so the four of them sat down together. With a sister to each side of him, he waited for Chelsea to reappear. The last he'd seen her was when they'd exchanged a hurried embrace behind the SUV.
Chelsea, dear, are you coming?
The lass's head appeared around the corner with a scowl on her face. The bright pink on her shoulder proved she'd found clothing. Had Austin brought it to her, or that other bastard? Alexander shot to his feet. "Is something the matter?" He looked over her shoulder while he reached into his sock for his skein do, but left it put when the lass held up a hand and shook her head.
Nothing's wrong.
She grumbled, then stepped away from the wall. She was covered from shoulder to foot in the same thick fuzzy cloth that covered the sisters, but where the other woman wore blue, Chelsea was ensconced in the pink. She had rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, but there was no question the clothes had come from their unwelcome chaperones. "A leisure suit, is it?" He tried not to grin too broadly. It wasn't that the clothes were less than flattering, which they were. It was that Chelsea seemed so unhappy to be wearing them. Of course, he'd prefer she were nothing but her shift, but no one would hear that thought leave his head. The woman to his right gave him a sharp scowl, Loretta, if he remembered aright. "Pardon?" he said to her. She shook her head at him, then turned a smile on the lass.
The pink suits you.
When the second sister started inquiring about underwear, Alexander shot to his feet. "I must check the perimeter,"
No, you mustn't.
Loretta said firmly.
Would you waste what time you have?
He relented and walked about the table to hold the chair for the lass. She leaned back against his hands as he reluctantly pulled them away. He had to force himself to return to his seat, but the women were watching them closely, even while they chatted about things he had no attention for. His ears were finally tuned to every word that fell from Chelsea's lips, however.
Really? A tea shop?
Loretta mumbled something about Edinburgh and Cockburn Street.
I've never been a fan of tea.
That explained why she hadn't partaken of the tea he served with breakfast.
I'm a waitress, or at least I was a waitress until Austin insisted that I stop working. It was a scary part of town, actually, so it was probably for the best. I don't know what I'll do when I get back.
She suddenly locked eyes with him, and the rest of the world slipped away. Her expression said everything he was thinking himself.
Why can't we talk privately? When will they leave? We have no time to waste.
Someone tapped his arm. Lorraine. She was saying something. "Pardon?"
I said it's a fine fish you caught.
Chelsea looked down at the platter and frowned, then looked up at him with raised brows.
You caught this?
Aye, he beamed proudly.
In that little stream?
Her evident doubt took a bit of that pride away. I must admit it doesn't seem likely. After all, the fish was larger than the sole of his boot. The lass swallowed uncomfortably, and he could only imagine what she must be thinking.
And you two are related to Sansaray? Yes, dear.
Loretta smiled sweetly and outright ignored what Chelsea implied.
So,
She pointed a fork at him.
you know what what he was?
Loretta looked him over.
A ghost?
Then she nodded and turned back to her meal.
Yes, dear, we know. Our Sonny can't do everything on her own. How can she? With so many to chase after.
Lorraine shook her head and took a sip of wine that painted her red even outside the confines of her lips.
She's having a devil of a time with that McGregor fellow. Of course, we knew she would, but, well, we promised to step in and help the pair of you.
Help us to do what? His instincts had him wrapping his left hand around his dining knife. The woman shrugged and wrinkled her nose at her sister.
You know, just help.
Something wasn't right about the women, but he couldn't say why. Of course they would have to be witches. After all, they were Moors, and twins to boot. But there was something else at play that he didn't understand. Were they there to make certain Chelsea went back to Austin? That she didn't throw her future happiness away for a brief tryst with a man who would only be mortal for a few hours more? Loretta laid her hand over his and gave it a little squeeze. The look in her eye was all pity. So she'd read his thoughts, and she was telling him what? That his suspicions were correct? He was affronted by the idea, truly. What kind of man would he be to allow the lass to be deprived for the rest of her life due to his selfishness? And yet each time he succumbed to the temptation to kiss her, he was luring her away from her true course. He studied her while she listened to the older women. She was a kind lass, to be sure, quick to apologize when she'd said something insensitive, quick to return his attentions, but also quick to excuse Austin, who walks on water, of all blame in the matter. But what kind of man would allow this lass to slip out of his grasp in the first place? A fool, obviously. And what kind of man was Alexander Fraser to spend the day trying to woo another man's woman when he would not be around a day from now to see to her care? Begrudgingly, it seemed that he and Austin had much in common. Chapter 17. Alexander checked the perimeter again. Still solid, still unforgiving. His destiny was still contained within its limits. He'd done all he could do. There was nothing left but the waiting, but it was cruel indeed to leave him wondering what he was waiting for. He let his mind wander back to the moor and wee Rabby. What would the lad be thinking? Or would he be lying in his grave again next to the dog, waiting for Sonny to rouse him again? Alexander could only hope. And the others, what were they making of Sonny's bargain? Would they be plotting for ways to resist her? Or would they be drawing lots and deciding who would be next? No matter. Wee Rabby would be next, and there was none that would challenge it. What happened after was none of his concern. He wouldn't be present to see it. All those years on the moor he'd kept his imagination at bay, refusing to wonder what waited for him in the next life, afraid he would never have the chance to see for himself what God had in store. But since Sonny built her great bonfire and summoned the strange ring of green light to protect her, from demons no doubt, Alexander had allowed himself to finally wonder, to hope, to want. Only what he wanted had naught to do with the afterlife. Heaven help him. One of the sisters caught Chelsea peeking out of the bedroom window, watching Alexander stomping around the fairy glen.
He's a lovely thing to watch, isn't he? Yes, he is. I can't help it.
The woman patted her on the valour-covered shoulder.
I'm sorry, dear. If we'd have come yesterday, maybe the two of you wouldn't have been so attached.
She turned and shrugged the hand away. She didn't want anyone's comfort. She just wanted more time, and she was feeling a little angry with the guy in the glen. It was like he was wasting time on purpose. The woman's smile was full of pity.
I'm sure it's the right thing to do, to stay away from each other. After all, if you get to liking each other too much, you'll suffer all the more when he's taken away.
Her patronizing smile dropped from her face when she took a good look at Chelsea. She patted the towel she had hanging over her arm.
I believe I'll take a shower.
Then she hurried into the bathroom. Stay away from each other. Who the hell were they to tell two adult strangers what to do? And for that matter, how dare Alexander avoid her? She was the one he needed to save, wasn't she? His damsel in distress. He should stay close, or he might screw up and miss his chance. Then where would he be? The bathroom door opened abruptly.
Uh-oh.
The woman said, and hurried to the door to press her ear against it. Chelsea had just decided the twins needed psychiatric help when she heard a commotion from the living room. "Get out of my way, woman!" It was Alexander's booming voice. She would know it anywhere. Lorraine stepped back from the door just before it flew open, and she cowered at the sight of an enraged Highlander in all his glory. He glowered at her, then looked for Chelsea and pinned her to the spot. "Dinna move, lass." She nodded quickly and wrapped her arms around herself to keep from shivering to death, but inside she was jumping up and down, cheering him on. "You!" He glared at Lorraine again. "Gather your sister and your groceries and leave this place. I dinna care if God himself sent ye. You've no place here." The woman swallowed and nodded, then beamed at them both as she scooted around him and out the door. She didn't act like her feelings were hurt. In fact, she looked a little pleased. While the sisters shuffled around in the next room, Chelsea stared into Alexander's eyes and waited. She still hadn't moved and hoped she would get credit for that. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then up to her eyes again, and a fresh wave of shivers crashed through her. The pink velour wasn't doing anything to stop them.
You can keep the clothes, dear. And Alexander, be sure to tell Sonny we did what she asked.
His brow furrowed, and finally their curiosity got the better of them, and together they stepped back into the living room. Alexander wrapped his hand around her wrist and held on tight, like he was afraid she might be taken from him if he wasn't careful. "Just what is it the lass asked of ye?" Lorraine pushed the screen open and stepped out, then turned back with a grin.
If you need to get them moving in a certain direction, you have to tell them they can't go that way.
Her sister wasn't nearly as amused and stepped close to Alexander while Lorraine held the door.
Please, son, don't be too hard on our son, Sarai. She agreed to the rules and must stick by them.
"Dinna worry o'er it, madam. I will always bless the ground she walks upon." Loretta reached up and patted his cheek, then left smiling, nearly as pleased as her sister. She was so afraid she'd jinx things. Chelsea didn't dare move until she was sure the car was gone. It was torture watching through a screen while the sister behind the wheel backed the SUV down the drive at about a foot a minute, and it was a long drive. When she couldn't hear the engine anymore, she jumped in the air like the Patriots had just won the Super Bowl again, but she stopped jumping as soon as she saw the look on Alexander's face. A million years of instincts told her to run. A couple dozen years of being an American told her to stand her ground. She couldn't seem to suppress either and ended up backing slowly away from him. He took a step for every one of hers, but since his stride was a lot longer, he'd closed the distance between them just as she'd reached the wall. He captured her hands and pressed his mouth to hers in a demanding kiss that she needed as badly as he did. Then he released one hand and pulled her along behind him into the bedroom, where he pressed her up against another wall and kicked the door shut. He watched her closely, waiting for her to protest, but she didn't. She was still in the mood to celebrate the fact that they were alone again, and that Alexander was done wasting time. He lowered his head and kissed her collarbone, and she giggled.
Thank you for saving us from those women.
His hand clamped over her mouth. There would be no talk of saving, aye. He looked up at the ceiling like he was looking for cameras, for anything that might prove someone was listening in. She nodded. He slowly removed his hand, but let his fingers drag across her lips just before he kissed her again, inhaling like he was trying to pull her into his lungs. It was intoxicating, being wanted that badly. Austin had never wanted her that badly.
Just so you know,
She said between kisses.
I'm not going back to Austin.
His lips pressed against her collarbone again and held her there for a long moment. He then pressed his head to her shoulder, and every cell in her body started to vibrate to the frequency of his laughter. But it wasn't a celebratory laughter at all. He was laughing at her. Hurt, she tried to push him away from her, but he put his hands on her hips and pulled her closer. Nay, lass, he still chuckled. Forgive me. It's just that I've only just banished the two things keeping us apart, and now, minutes away from claiming you as my own, or so it seemed, you've landed on the one thing that could cut through this lovely haze and speak to my sense of reason.
Reason?
Aye. He took her arms, one at a time, and encouraged them to wrap over his shoulders and around his neck. The reason we're here in the first place. The reason I must not claim what cannot be mine in truth. She knew it was a risky thing to say, but she said it anyway.
My heart can be yours.
He smiled sadly into her eyes and held up his finger and thumb with about an inch between them. A small corner, perhaps. She forced his fingers farther apart and nodded. He laughed and swatted her on the butt. Come, Chelsea, let us go see how small are these non-enchanted inhabitants of the burn, aye.
So you think those twins were witches too?
Nay, my lass, for the rest of our time together, I choose not to think of them at all. Chapter 18. So, this is my noble deed. Alexander laughed down at the lass while she spoke to a wee frog she held captive on the knee of her peculiar pink suit. No matter what she wore, she was the most endearing lass he'd known in his life, and he'd seen thousands upon thousands of them cross the moor. Some even came back regularly, like Sonny did, but none so charming as Chelsea. And giving her up, sending her back to the man who would treat her well and care for her, would require heroic effort indeed. Though he still kept his spear near and his blade in his sock, he no longer worried about Austin's self-appointed henchman. The man had made no trouble that day, and Alexander surmised that the photographs he'd taken to sully Chelsea's good name were enough to soothe his need for vengeance. He also believed that if Austin was worth his salt, he wouldn't question the lass when she explained what truly happened here. Hopefully, she would see the wisdom in leaving out a few details. When Chelsea placed the wee frog into his hand for safekeeping and ran back up to the cottage to fetch some things, he took the opportunity to attempt contact with Sonseray. "Sonny, you wee thing," he called out to the glen as a whole. "If you can hear my voice, heed me. I will not send the lass back until the morrow, when my days are done, aye. Not until the morrow, I beg ye." A slight breeze wove through the leaves high above his head, and on that breeze he heard the laughter of a dear and familiar voice. Laughter. It was a fine answer, and he was finally able to take a deep breath into his belly and release the tension he'd been holding there all afternoon. Tomorrow. He had until tomorrow. The lass returned with a large glass jar, and into its depths she placed the wee frog. She was pleased he hadn't allowed it to get away. He didn't tell her how tempted he'd been to use it as bait. It might have broken her heart, and he preferred to end as a fond memory for her. The creature struggled to find its way out, and with her tapping on the glass and offering soothing reassurance, the frog only panicked more. All at once, Chelsea burst into tears and apologized a dozen times to the creature, while she took the glass to the water and freed it. He set his pole aside and joined her. "What is it, lass?" She straightened and smiled through a sheen of tears.
It was the glass. An invisible barrier to him, Braid. I just felt so awful for scaring him like that.
Her eyes began to leak again, despite her brave smile. He chuckled and pulled her against him. "Wheesht now, I'm no frog, aye, and this is no bottle to imprison me forever. It was a means to bring ye to me, to keep the pair of us together so both our hearts could mend, I think." She nodded against him. "The gloaming comes. Let us go inside and talk of cheerful things, aye." He cut his bait, gathered the tackle, and put it all back where he'd found it, while the lass put the kettle on. They settled in front of the fire, and he tried to teach her how to appreciate tea. Rain pattered gently on the roof, and she wondered how the traumatized frog was faring. When the topic of frogs and what might make them happy ran its course, their conversation became a complicated maze. Any talk of his village invariably turned to Meredith. Talking of her own life included too many stories that involved Austin. She grew instantly sad at the mention of Culloden, likely for the reminder that he'd died there, and that he hadn't been flesh and blood until he'd been sent to the cottage. The only safe discussions were general in nature. She seemed to appreciate his country. He could appreciate American cinema. The fire burnt low and reminded them that time was running short. But no matter how desperately he wanted to take her into his arms and hold her until dawn, counting every last heartbeat between them, he would not. He went to the hearth and picked up a thick log. She put a hand out.
Don't. No more.
But he didn't think she referred to the wood or the conversation. He was fairly certain she was wanting an end to the torture. He dropped the log back on the pile and spread the coals so they could die in peace. A pair of glass doors closed over the opening, finished the job, and they were suddenly facing each other in the darkness. He groped behind him for the box of matches and breathed carefully as she stepped toward him. "Pleasant dreams, lass. Take the matches to light your candle, aye, and I'll see ye on the morrow." He reached for her hand to place the matches in her care, but the lass took hold of his hand and headed toward the bedchamber with him in tow. Her speed denied him of the chance to set his feet and resist. When they were inside, she tried to close the door, but he blocked it with his body. "Nay, Chelsea, I must sleep on the couch. You must bide the night alone." He flipped up the light switch and hoped the harsh glare of the light bulbs would help her see reason. She blinked, rolled her eyes, then went to the nightstand to light the candle. After the fire caught, she waved the match out and gestured toward the bed. Heaven help him, his heart tripped in his chest and bid him stay, but he could not.
Just because you're in here doesn't mean we have to do it. And I'm not going to waste our last hours together with a stupid wall between us. I mean, What if I think of something important I need to say and I'll forget it by morning, huh? What then?
She shook her head and pulled down the blankets.
Nope. You're staying in here, or I'm gonna stay there with you, but my way. We both get to be comfortable.
Dinna bet money on that, he muttered to himself. She snorted, then went into the restroom.
You better be there when I come out.
It was a tricky promise to make, so he said nothing. By the time she emerged, however, he'd created a lovely pallet on the floor next to the bed, and he lay on his back with his hands behind his head, grinning like a cat. She grinned back, not nearly as disappointed as he expected her to be, and he sobered a bit himself when he realized she was wearing nothing but her shift.
Okay.
She said, and jumped onto the bed. Then she hung her head over the side.
If your back hurts in the morning, don't blame me.
If my back hurts in the morning, lass, it willna be hurting for long, will it? Her head disappeared, and he realized at once that his quip had been insensitive. He quickly sat up and leaned close. Forgive me, Chelsea. My lass, please. Had it taken a moment to consider. She cut off his apology with a kiss. Her hand wended its way around his neck and pulled him close. He was now crawling onto the mattress before he was aware enough to stop himself.
Good night, Alexander,
She whispered against his lips, then put only the slightest effort into pushing him away. Godspeed, he whispered back, then sank back down onto his pallet. And no matter how difficult it would be to stay on that pallet through the night, he was grateful she'd forced him to join her in the room. For that last kiss, he wouldn't have missed it for the world. Chapter 19. In the darkest hour of the night, the candle sputtered and died. Chelsea could tell by his breathing that he hadn't slept any more than she had, but at least the dark didn't bother her at all, knowing he was close. Chelsea. His voice jump-started her heart.
I'm here,
She said. That's fine then. I thought you might be awake, and I simply wanted to hear your voice.
Oh, okay. Do you want to know what I'm thinking?
Absolutely not. And together they laughed themselves silly. By morning, he was curled around her in the middle of the bed, like a fox protecting its young. She only wished they could have stayed that way all day. But at least if she held really still, it could last a little longer. Of course, there was no chance she'd fall back to sleep, knowing that witch would be coming to get him soon. That was, if she wasn't really just imagining this all while she languished in a coma in a Scottish hospital. Maybe she'd been struck by a car while running down the road in her wedding gown. You've a wondrous gift for snoring, Alexander murmured in her ear, and the vibrations of his deep, rich voice were too delicious to be imagined. She gasped and scooted around to face him.
Take it back.
I take it back. Then he winked. She laughed, and the delightful sound was as charming as the tinkling of bells, until she stopped her laughing and the ringing continued. Someone was at the door. It took a handful of minutes before they were both dressed and presentable. It was hard to zip up her jumpsuit or help Alexander get his brooch pinned when her hands were shaking so hard.
Is this it? Is Sonny here to take you away?
He shook his head and gave her hand a squeeze. Nay, lass, my sweet lass, if Sonny was within 100 metres of the place, I would ken. Only slightly relieved, she ducked into the kitchen, and he went to see who was then beating on the door. She stood with her back against the wall, straining to hear, and held her breath when Alexander pulled the door open. I have to talk to her. It was Rick. She'd almost hoped it was Austin. What was wrong with the man if he couldn't come after her himself? No. Alexander started to close the door, but it jammed, probably on Rick's foot. It's an emergency. Rick said, and even though she knew it was just his usual ploy, she decided to talk to him. Alexander gave her a warning look, then stepped back and let her stand beside him. She noticed his right hand raise and wrap around his giant pencil, but he just let his arm hang there like he was leaning on the door jamb. Rick narrowed his eyes at her for a second, and she smiled back, knowing that if the guy made the wrong move, Alexander would skewer him. 2 feet away from her mortal enemy, and she couldn't have felt safer.
I won't believe a word you say, but say it anyway.
She crossed her arms and waited. Austin has gone to the police, he said. He's convinced you're being held against your will somewhere, and that the text you sent wasn't from you. He's getting them to trace your phone. Where is it? He tried to look past them into the house.
That's bull,
she said.
He wouldn't think that unless you said it. If he saw the pictures...
There were no pictures. At least when I got back to the castle, they weren't there anymore. The video, everything, erased. She shrugged.
Well, let him come. I'm not afraid to talk to him or anyone else. And this is Scotland, Rick. They won't surround the place and start shooting.
Rick growled. Don't be stupid, Cheese. I can't believe you're still here in the first place. But if you go now, you can spare him some humiliation. Get in the car and I'll take you to the... What are you wearing?
Go away, Rick. I wouldn't get into a car with you if you were the last ride out of town and the volcano had erupted.
She nodded to Alexander and stepped back so he could close the door. But Rick rushed between them into the house. A split second later, he was lying on his back with the giant pencil poised above his throat. The sharp tip was pushed a good inch into his skin. He gasped like the wind had been knocked out of him. Alexander really could protect her against anything. Maybe he really had come there to be her hero. But did that mean he was going to be taken away now? Gravel crunched outside. The screen door was still propped open, and she had a clear view of Austin getting out of a rental car and hustling up the drive. Her heart tripped at the sight of him. It wasn't exactly love that tripped it, more like the memory of love. It seemed like they hadn't seen each other for a month. In jeans and a t-shirt, she nearly forgot they were in Scotland. It was just another day in her life with Austin stopping by after work. She shook her head to clear the tainted image, but it was still Austin who walked through the door, and she felt her world would crack down the centre, like glass under pressure. There was no telling if it was going to hold, or where the pieces would fall if it failed. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, but held up a hand like some signal guard. "We'll talk in a minute, okay? But right now, I have to deal with him." He gestured to Alexander and the idiot on the floor.
His name is Alexander.
Austin shook his head. "Not him. Him." He pointed to Rick, then put his hands on his knees and leaned over him. "Comfortable, Rick?" He glanced up at Alexander. "Can you keep him there?" The big man nodded. "Aye." "Good." Austin had a nasty grin on his face that Chelsea had never seen before. "Look what the staff delivered to me this morning, buddy." He held up a small silver device. "Recognize this?" "No," Rick whispered. "Well, you should. You're always carrying it around with you, leaving it on restaurant tables. Remember now." Rick said nothing. "Maybe this will jog your memory." Austin bit his bottom lip, sneered, and pressed a button. His own voice sounded in the room. "Marrying her would have cost me a whole lot more than moving the wedding party to Scotland." "Yeah, but it would have been worth it." "You think?" Austin turned off the recorder. "Is that what you played for her, buddy, when you went to check on her one last time?" He straightened and faced her. "I can't expect you to forgive me, Chelsea, for letting this snake get between us."
I like to call him the worm. Weasel works too.
He cut off the part where I said I could either marry Erica and be powerful, or marry you and be happy for the rest of my life. What idiot chooses power over happiness? She smiled.
That's just what I thought you would say. Just what I needed to hear. So I told that kid to ask you to come talk to me. I knew if you did, I would be fine.
But I let Rick go instead. He shook his head. I was so worried about what it would look like if I walked out that I jumped at his offer. I should have suspected something when it took him a good 10 minutes to come back and say that you'd run off. It sounded good. It always sounded good when Austin talked. He was just so perfect. Look, sweetheart, I'm not making you do anything you don't want to do. I'm just letting you know. He pointed at Rick without looking at him. That this scum is out of my life for good. There's plenty of room now, and I'm saving all the seats for you. He then frowned and turned to face Alexander. I think you can let him up now. Alexander narrowed his eyes and studied Austin for a minute, then nodded and stepped back, taking his weapon with him. Rick rolled onto his knees, then stood, holding one hand against his bloody neck. You're going to jail, he told the Scot. Austin stepped up into his face. And when I asked you to call the airline, you said she'd already flown home. He bent his arm and gave an uppercut to Rick's jaw with his very solid elbow. The guy went flying backward and landed on the floor in front of the couch. Then he curled into a ball and screamed while holding his chin. Austin turned to Alexander and held his hand out. The Scot moved his weapon to his left hand and shook Austin's, but Austin pulled him off balance with a jerk and planted a left hook into the side of Alexander's face. That's for falling in love with my fiancée. Don't bother denying it. The Scot narrowed his eyes, picked up Austin, and rushed toward the hearth.
Don't!
She shouted. Alexander skidded to a stop and dropped Austin's butt onto the bricks, but the way her fiancé grunted when he bounced, she thought the Scot had probably given gravity a little help. When he turned to her, he wasn't happy. She shrugged.
He might have hit his head on that fireplace.
Alexander nodded sharply. That was my plan. She laughed, knowing he must have been joking. At least, she was hoping he'd been joking.
What now?
Austin got to his feet and stretched his back. Now, you choose. Chapter 20. Austin gave her a sad little smile, then walked to the couch and pulled Rick to his feet. The guy was still moaning. I'm going to take this garbage into town, and then I'm returning to the castle. If you don't come by sundown, I'll know you didn't choose me. He stopped in front of her, dug keys out of his pocket, and handed them to her. Here, you can have the rental at the bottom of the hill. I'll take Rick in the one he parked on the street. He paused for a second or two, then sighed. Believe me when I say, I still want you as much, no, more than I did a few days ago when I was standing in that chapel, and if you want, we can start over. See what the world looks like without Rick in the picture. She bit her lip and nodded, but resisted the urge to reach out and touch him. She didn't want to hurt him any more than she already had, and a gentle touch would give him hope. He gave her a wink and forced himself to smile, then turned and dragged Rick out the door. She turned back to Alexander and nearly jumped out of her skin when she found they were not alone. A young woman in a long black robe stood next to Alexander, with her arm wrapped around his waist. Obviously caught in the middle of a hug, the girl stepped back and let go of him.
You're Sonny,
Chelsea said, but she hadn't meant to sound quite so snotty.
and you're Chelsea?
She had to admire the way the girl didn't sneer at the way she was dressed. It was obviously taking effort to keep her gaze from dropping to the pink monstrosity. Finally, the girl giggled and pointed to the old lady sneakers on Chelsea's feet.
I must apologise for my aunties. I told them to bring you clothes. I didn't mean for them to bring you their clothes.
Chelsea would have laughed along, but it was sinking in. She was standing in front of a real witch, a girl who had known she was stuck in a cottage with only a wedding dress and a sheet. And Alexander really had been a ghost since 1746. She thought she'd already come to terms with it, but apparently she hadn't. Alexander moved fast, got behind her, and caught her before she realized she was collapsing. "There, you see," he said. "I finally caught you before you fell." Yes, he'd caught her, and he felt very solid at her back. There was no way this guy was just going to disappear.
"'Tis time,"
said Sonny. Chelsea wished she didn't know what she was talking about. Alexander scooped her into his arms and carried her to the couch. For the span of a couple of heartbeats, he squeezed her tight while she held onto his neck for dear life.
"What if we never let go?"
she whispered. He pulled her shoulders close and kissed her on the forehead, then lowered her to the couch and stepped back. She shook her head and tried to inhale the tears building up in her eyes.
"You lied, you know.
He grimaced and nodded.
You said you wouldn't harm me, and you did. You're hurting me now. So if you mean to keep your promise, you have to stay."
Nay, lass, ye ken I canna be kind to ye now, for the kindness itself would be the meanest act of all. I'll put your things in the car, and ye must go. Every breath ye take worries at the string of my heart, and I cannot endure much more of it. Go, he repeated, and smile as you do, so I can know that a bonny lass will live happily ever after.
"And you'll go, too?"
Aye, I must.
"Then I will never come to Scotland again."
He tipped his head back, and she watched his neck move while he swallowed once, then twice. Nothing for you here, lass. It ended as a whisper, and he hurried into the bedroom. Sonny sat quietly on the hearth and stared out the open doorway while Chelsea counted the teardrops alternating down her cheeks. She lost track of the number before Alexander strode through the room with a wedding gown under one arm and his hands gripping her fancy shoes and her purse. She stood and somehow made it to the door. He met her at the top of the steps. She smiled like he'd asked.
"All right, then. I'm going,"
she whispered. He whispered back, "And I was never here to begin with." She let the tears flow as she made her way down the drive since no one could see her face. The footing was slippery due to the rains that had fallen all night. She wondered where she'd be the next time it rained. Once she was in the car, she was careful not to look up the hill again. It took a second to figure out the controls. She hadn't driven on the wrong side of the road yet, let alone the wrong side of the car. She had worried that she would need to be left-handed in order to pull it off well, but thankfully, not all the controls were reversed. Thank goodness, she only needed to go a couple of miles to the castle. Chapter 21. Alexander closed his eyes to keep Chelsea's retreat from being branded into his mind for eternity. Then he tipped back his head and prayed Sonny would spare him. "Take me now, Sonny. Take me back to young Rabby. Spare the pair of us from another moment of this." Chelsea's engine turned, but the hum of it was quickly silenced. The ground fell away beneath him and returned just as quickly as it had gone. He opened his eyes and found himself standing on Culloden Moor, on the footpath near a vivid expanse of pink heather. The colour immediately brought to mind a certain questionable jogging suit. Sansa stood next to him.
"What will you say to Rabby?"
"What would you do with the laddie? Surely you'd not have his heart broken, as you've done to me."
"Nay, Alexander, and your heart may not have been broken when all was said and done, but you gave up your boon to speak with Rabby again, remember?"
"You mean to tell me Chelsea would have otherwise been my boon?" She wagged her head neither one way nor the other.
"Might have. For I might have been able to leave you with her, had her love been strong enough. And had you not forced that promise for me before you left the moor?
She winced.
Och, I shouldn't have told you. No good will come of it. Only to make you sadder. Forgive me.
He heaved a heavy breath in and out again, then shook his head. Nothing to forgive, sonny. She truly did belong with Austin. She'll be happiest going back and claiming his heart. He seems a fine man. The lass rolled her eyes.
Generous to the end.
A sudden thought twisted one of his cheeks with a sly smile. Aye, generous. Only the man won't think so when his bride thinks of me from time to time, and she will. He looked about the moor for a moment, remembering the desire to see it in the full light of day while he still had human eyes to see it with. The mosses were bright and green, the turf around the clan stones was rich emerald, the stones of the cairn had been freshly washed with night's rain, and the air filled his lungs with memories. Rabby sat in his usual place, petting the hide off Dauphin, but his attention caught on Sonny, and he hurried forward without hesitation. The rest, milling about in their pale forms, seemed not to notice they'd returned. Sonny tugged on his sleeve.
We've only a moment or two, lads. Say your piece.
Sir, you've come back after all. I told the others you would, and I've told Dauphin 100 times. Alexander turned to Sonny and gave her a sober look. I asked what you had in store for the lad.
Everyone gets their chance to be a hero, each in his own way, aye? And only happiness awaits this laddie on the other side of tomorrow. I swear it.
She grinned at the boy.
But you didn't wish to hear it from me, do you, Rabby?
The boy ducked sheepishly, then peeked up at Alexander. Is it true then, sir? You were able to prove yourself? He nodded firmly, only that moment coming to realise that it was true. If he'd have tried to keep the lass to himself, he'd have been a most selfish scoundrel and unworthy of her. But his heart wouldn't see reason and twisted in his chest to punish him for his surrender. Aye, laddie, I've proved myself and I've spent my boon. Now I'm away to better things, aye. So if you be a canny lad, you'll do as Sansere suggests. She loves you like her own, as I do. We've not led you astray. Misty ghosts of tears swirled in the corners of the lad's eyes and trickled down his cheeks. He turned to Sonny. I'll be happy to go now, miss, if I need not wait until dark and your strange fire. Sonny nodded.
You go and say your goodbyes to the lads, then I'll be right along. I need to finish with Fraser first, aye?
Rabby threw his arms around Alexander's middle, and to their mutual surprise, the lad was as solid as could be. Alexander felt the embrace all the way to his bones, and it gave him a peaceful satisfaction he'd never expected. Thank you, sir, for watching o'er me all this while. It has been strange indeed to spend a day away from you. I can only imagine. Nay, laddie, I'll see you on the other side. You just do what you can to prove yourself, so I will not be waiting long, aye? Aye, sir. Sonny waved the lad away toward the clanstones, and after a quick wave of his own, he hurried away. Thank you, lass.
A boon well spent, I'd say.
Aye. Sonny stepped forward and gave him a heartfelt embrace as well. It made him feel as if he were king for a day.
Do you know the problem I have with a man like you, Alexander Fraser?
Nay, lass, tell me.
You do nothing but earn boons, aye? You never cash them in.
Pardon?
You do a noble deed, looking out for Rabby all these years, for example. You help me mend the lass's heart and remove a nasty thorn from her life, aye?
Aye?
And instead of accepting a boon for such noble deeds, you earn yet another boon for sacrificing more just to see a wee lad's mind set at ease. When you ken full well, I would have done right by him. Do you see?
He tilted his head, not daring to misunderstand. What is your point, Sonny? She sighed.
Only that you make it difficult to do my work here. I've so many boons to offer, truth be told, and I find I have an extra one in my pocket, as it were. For apparently the boon you requested to come back and speak with the laddie cost you no boon at all.
He took the muddled lass's head in his hands and forced her to look him in the eye. Boon's in your pocket. Discard the balderdash, sonny, and say what you mean to say.
I was stalling for time.
Why, must we wait until night to finish it? She shook her head, and his hands fell away. She lifted an arm and pointed to the car park.
It's a full 8 miles from here to the cottage. 10 to Castle Murray.
Still not understanding what distance had to do with the death he was about to experience, he followed her gesture. A red SUV pulled into a stall and stopped. Two vaguely familiar but still unwelcome faces grinned his way. He said a quick prayer for patience and was just turning away when the back door of the vehicle opened and a pair of shocking pink legs appeared. "My favourite shade of pink," he murmured.
What's that?
Sonny mocked.
You make no sense, Alexander. Get to the point.
He spared her a glance over his shoulder as he stared toward the car park. "The point is, I love you dearly, you soft-hearted witch." He didn't slow until he was within 3 meters of her. She finally slowed as well, but it was too late and they slammed into one another. It nearly took his breath away. He jumped back and looked her over, sure he'd broken something. She only laughed. His mind scrambled for the perfect thing to say, but he couldn't wait for inspiration, so he said the first thing that appeared on his tongue. "Chelsea, lass, how do you feel?"
Seriously?
She laughed again. "What I mean is, do you still feel as if you belong to a certain someone?" Her eyes widened.
Oh, I get it. You want to know if I'm still spoken for.
He frowned. I wasn't there to see which way you turned." She nodded.
Well, I headed back to the castle.
He held his expression and waited.
I mean, I had to get my suitcase and get out of this get-up, right?
He nodded slightly, still waiting.
But there was this red SUV parked sideways in the road. Apparently their job was to keep me from going back to Austin.
She picked at her pink jacket.
They wouldn't even let me go back for my clothes.
He cocked a brow. "And a good thing too. Another minute or two and I might have been gone." All the teasing was replaced by horror, and she clutched at his arms.
Really? I'm so sorry.
He shook his head and pulled her closer. "A jest, my love. Apparently, I had another boon I hadn't cashed as yet."
The sisters.
She pointed to the car.
They said, well, you're still here. And you don't feel like a ghost.
"I'm nae a ghost, lass.
So the boon is...
The boon I choose is ye." He sealed his pledge with the most sincere kiss he could muster, and yet she laughed. He gave her a frown for good measure.
It's a good thing I chose you then, isn't it?
When Chelsea married him a few days later, surrounded by Muirs who honestly made them both nervous, it was in the small, ancient chapel of his childhood village. There was no roof left of the church itself. The walls had worn down to half their original height, but the flowers blooming where the pews had once been made for a pretty picture. The bride insisted that the location would give him closure, and while they stood there and waited for permission to kiss again, he decided that all he truly needed in his life was for the woman holding his hands to be content holding them. For she was a boon he would never, ever surrender. This has been Fraser, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 6, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Copyright 2015 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.